Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is story about what if Naruto rejects Team 7 Part 1. Before I start, please do support for more amazing content and comments for Part 2. Do consider to subscribe my channel and share my video to your friends and check out the description as well. Let's start the video. A wise man had once said that life is a long road that is easy to get lost on at the moment. Naruto was feeling somewhat lost on that road. Looking back, he realized that he must have taken a wrong turn somewhere since the road had gone in what in his opinion was a rather disturbing direction without him realizing it until it was too late. And before I could go up to her, Ino got her hands on her and turned her into rabid Sasuke fangirl number 2. Naruto said miserably to his companion that evening. He knew that he should be at home resting or preparing himself for whatever farce Kakashi decided to spring on him and his new team tomorrow, but he had needed someone to commiserate with about his sucky new assignment. And Suzume had shown up like a gift from heaven. After he'd run into her after she'd been leaving the administration complex at the end of the mission she'd been on for the last couple of weeks, they had gone to the bar that Tetsuo-sensei had brought them to celebrate Suzume and Satoshi's promotions to Chunin, since Ichiraku's was now reserved for high points during his life. The bar fit his mood quite nicely since it was both a place where shinobi tended to go to commiserate about their problems, and the place where his team had pretty much split apart. It had been a while since the team had split apart, and a while since he and Suzume had seen each other, so they had some catching up to do. As he was still a genin, he had gotten cranberry juice, but that was okay since he didn't like alcohol all that much anyway. Suzume had ordered sake because they were in a bar, but wasn't drinking very much of it. Based on the occasional winces, she seemed to share his views on the flavor of alcohol. Her cup had spent far more time on the table than it did in her hand, and the takuri was mostly full. Now I'm expected to be on a team with both of them, and I'm certain that Kakashi will know if I try and throw tomorrow's test and report me. And I'm still considering doing it anyway. He continued unhappily. I don't even know why Kakashi wants to be my sensei. I was perfectly happy with Tetsuo-sensei. Suzume quietly gave him a pitying look. Apparently, if it was her, she wouldn't have wanted to be stuck in the same situation he was in either. Tetsuo-sensei was a good teacher whom none of them would have traded for the world, and it had been his impression that Suzume and Satoshi would have eventually returned to the team after they'd had their chance to fly on a few B-ranked missions if this hadn't happened. And how was your mission? He finally asked after having forced his teammate to listen to him for over an hour. He'd been taught some manners over the years and knew that it wouldn't be polite to spend the entire evening trying to get some sympathy over his fate, and not offer a shoulder of his own should it be needed, even if his mood was a completely crappy one at the moment. He knew that something was up with Suzume as well, since she hadn't looked entirely happy when he'd run into her, but it was more of a my day was crappy unhappy rather than the my life just got completely steamrolled. Unhappy he was feeling. It absolutely sucked. Suzume replied. The client would not stop hitting on me. I wouldn't have minded it so much if he were young and handsome, but he had to be like 50, and he was missing half his teeth. On the way back, we decided to stop at an onsen. Unfortunately for us in this case, it was a mixed bath. What should have been a very relaxing evening was completely ruined when this white-haired pervert stared at me and Eri the entire time, not even bothering to try and hide the fact that he was doing so. As Suzume shared her problems, he listened to his teammate as attentively as he could. Not only was it the polite thing to do, but you never knew what you could learn when you did so. Someone had once let a good bit of blackmail material slip without realizing it in his presence, and he would have missed it if he hadn't been paying attention. Since then, he never wasted an opportunity to needle the person in question with his knowledge he'd gained every time he encountered him. Right now, however, he was providing a sympathetic ear for his teammate, and a shoulder to cry on since she had done the same for him. Sasuke growled as he pummeled the training dummy with his fists. The idiot, the moron, the dead last had been a genin for 2 years, and he hadn't so much not noticed it as refused to believe it until he'd had his nose rubbed in undeniable proof of the fact. The person who had been held up as being the most likely to fail since day one at the academy had surpassed him and left him in the dust long before he'd even realized that he'd flown by, and instead of trying to catch up and surpass him like he should have been doing, he'd spent 2 years ignoring the now very obvious dust cloud that had been left in his wake. As he pummeled the dummy he was training with, he reviewed his and the Uzumaki's time at the academy together, trying to see if there were signs of when and how this had happened. As he thought back on it, there had been one phrase that constantly came out of the mouth of the boy who, now that he thought about it, managed to catch a chunin in a trap that only utilized a chalkboard eraser and a bit of grease. And that was "I was joking." Shuriken go flying everywhere except the target, and nearly take out the sensei. I was joking. Kunai hits a bird passing overhead rather than the stationary target 5 feet below it. I was joking. The assistant instructor's kneecap nearly gets broken due to a wild and unpredictable move. You get the picture. Every single time after every single failure, he'd hear "I was joking." Back then, he had thought that it had been the idiot's way of trying to cover for his obvious inadequacies, especially considering the fact that the boy couldn't even do a proper bunshin. He was wrong, however. Apparently, the Uzumaki really had just been joking around. The little bastard had played him. He'd played all of them, and when he'd gotten bored with his little game, he went and blew through the graduation exam like it was nothing. Now, knowing that the Uzumaki could have graduated any time he'd wanted to, he tried to think it through to find a logical reason for why he would do such a thing. It didn't make sense. Why would the Uzumaki do something like that, something so absolutely pointless, when he could be well on his way in his ninja career? After several moments of thought, he finally remembered the most likely reason for why the Uzumaki behaved the way he had. After an eye that man had killed the clan, the laws had been changed, and the lowest age at which anyone could graduate the academy had been raised to 10. Because of this, the Uzumaki had been forcibly held back for who knew how many years. Long and tedious years in which the Uzumaki had undoubtedly grown bored just as he had near the end of his stay at the academy. He'd heard stories about geniuses who were held back and destroyed their surroundings out of sheer boredom. One of the reasons Uchiha Madara had been sent out on the battlefield at such a young age had been because of the chaos he had been causing in the clan encampment. While Naruto hadn't been setting tents on fire and destroying cooking pots, he had caused enough chaos that the academy had finally been willing to let him go, and been glad of it. Now, knowing what the Uzumaki was, he knew that he would have to find a way to surpass him before he would be ready to kill that man. If he could find a way to defeat one true genius, he would be able to find a way to defeat another. Sakura checked her supplies again, feeling apprehensive about what the morning and the future following it would hold. She would be taking a test with her team, a test that would decide the team's future, including even if they would still be a team following the test, and she feared how Sasuke would react if she caused them to fail. Sasuke would be extremely disappointed, and probably would reject her in favor of Ino. Naruto would. On the day Naruto had pinned her and threatened her, she had complained to her mother about how Naruto had threatened to break her arm practically the instant she got home. Her mother had promptly dragged her down to the office of the civilian peacekeeping force that had risen up in the wake of the Uchiha massacre to deal with civilian-on-civilian crime to make a report. Once they got there, her mother had stormed straight up to the desk of the first officer she spotted, dragging her in her wake. "I want that monster arrested!" her mother yelled. As soon as she had gotten the attention of the officer she dragged her in front of. "Who are you talking about, ma'am?" the female officer asked, as she tried to calm her mother down. "The Uzumaki boy, who else?" her mother replied. After her mother's demand, the officer went over to a computer and started putting in information. Whatever results she received once the information had been processed had caused a frown to mar her rather plain features. She looked rather apologetic when she returned soon after. "I'm sorry," the officer said when she reached her desk where she and her mother were standing. "Uzumaki Naruto is a registered shinobi, and therefore you'll have to file your complaint at the administration complex." Snarling obscenities under her breath, her mother grabbed her, turned, angrily stormed out of the station, and dragged her all the way to the administration complex, where she then dragged her all the way over to the desks where people registered civilian complaints against shinobi. "I would like to file a complaint against Uzumaki Naruto," her mother said to the bored-looking ninja at the desk the instant she arrived. "What is the nature of this complaint?" the ninja asked, grabbing a form and a pen. "That filthy little monster threatened to break my daughter's arm," her mother replied. "At what time was this threat made, and where were you and what were you doing at the time?" the Chunin asked as he started filling out information on the form. "I was outside the academy. I had just gotten out of class for the day, and noticed him hanging around on that swing in the tree near the entrance. I tried to hit him," she replied, deciding to leave the for pretending to be a ninja part out considering the reason for her current location. "Let me get this straight," the man said coldly as he crumpled the form that he'd started filling out. "You, an academy student, decided to attack a full-fledged shinobi who is only a genin because he had a run of seriously bad luck, and isn't currently on his way to the Chunin exams because we don't want to give IWA a chance to legally get their revenge on him for what he did to two of their genin. And you want us to punish him because he decided to go easy on you and let you off with a warning? As they say, hindsight is 20/20. She should never have let her mother drag her to the tower considering the fact that Naruto had already informed her of what would happen, and she should never have asked what Naruto had done to those IWA genin. The desk ninja who had apparently heard the story from a friend of his who was a jounin who had been to the Chunin exams and Kiri had gleefully told her in vivid and extremely gruesome detail. Funny, Sasuke had never seemed to notice that she had kept silent about Naruto's ninja status or lack thereof after that. If Naruto had been willing to do something like that to people who had just gotten in the way of his promotion, what would he do to her if she failed tomorrow's test? That question haunted her for the rest of the evening as she prepared, hoping that she didn't mess up and upset either Naruto or Sasuke-kun. Kakashi polished one of the bells against his sleeve before checking it again for any spots or smudges. Everything had to be perfect for tomorrow, including the bells that had been in use since the night aim had first taken a team. Because Omaro, Minato-sensei's son, would be his student. Despite the fact that the kid seemed to resent the fact that he'd been taken from his other sensei, and the fact that he was Chunin in all but name, it would be worth it. He owed it to Minato-sensei to make sure that Naruto was at least half the man he had been. He had failed everyone else. Obito was gone, Rin was gone, Kushina-san was gone, and Minato-sensei was gone. Naruto was all he had left. Naruto grumbled as the alarm clock got him up a little earlier than usual. He wasn't as bright-eyed and bushy-tailed as he'd normally be in the morning since he'd spent half the night commiserating over his new assignment and questioning the mental faculties of the Hokage with Suzume. Suzume had had a bit of a rough few weeks herself as well. Along with the dangers of being a shinobi, kunoichi were forced to endure men constantly staring at them, and making advances or worse because they were women. The white-haired pervert who had ruined Suzume's bath was going on his prank list. He'd know him when he ran into him, since he got a good description of him from Suzume. Right now, though, he was feeling even sorrier for himself than he was for his teammate. He'd been put on what had to have been the genin team from hell. There had been a time when he would have been over the moon at being placed on a team with Sakura, and an admittedly much shorter period of time when he would have been happy to be on a team with Sasuke. That time, however, had long since passed. Time had changed them and his views of them, and not for the better. He had once had a massive crush on the pink-haired girl named Sakura, and allowed her to hit him because that was the only physical contact he had gotten from her, and he had believed that it would be worth all of the pain and misery in the end when he and Sakura were together. In those days, he'd had a really naive view of what a boyfriend was, and after learning from his teammates who had already started navigating such relationships, he now knew that what he had actually wanted from Sakura had been to be her friend. Back then, the most he had wanted from the girl was a couple of dinner dates, and for her to hang out with him, which was pretty much the definition of friend. Admittedly, he hadn't gone about winning her over the right way, even though he did give her presents. But, as Tetsuo-sensei and Suzume had explained, her reaction to him had been both extreme and extremely abusive, and that any relationship that developed should he have managed to win her over would most likely be an unhealthy and abusive one, since there was a good chance that Sakura would have continued to abuse him out of habit even if he had become her friend. Sakura was like a rose. She was pretty to look at, but, man, did she have thorns. Sasuke was a rather thorny issue himself. At the beginning of their time at the academy, when they had still been small and he'd been in a different class, Sasuke had been a rather nice boy. He'd even played with the Uchiha a couple of times before the boy's father interfered and told him not to associate with him. Then, he changed, and not for the better. It was understandable why he changed considering, but still, Sasuke had always been a much better student than him, and back then, that had frustrated him to no end. He had hurt and humiliated himself many times trying to prove himself the Uchiha's equal, and all he had gotten from the boy in return was cold dismissal. Even then, he still would have been willing to be the boy's friend had he but asked, but there came the day that ruined any chance of friendship whatsoever in his book. That day had been the day he had first run into Sasuke after he had graduated. The one time he had achieved something before Sasuke, the boy had ignored his accomplishment rather than acknowledge it, and, as he later learned from Ichiraku-sensei, chose to completely deny that it had ever happened. Having either Sasuke or Sakura on the team he could have learned to deal with, but, having both, however, throwing the true genin test would be his best option. He was already a genin, so the worst that could happen to him in this case would be for him to be returned to Tetsuo-sensei with a black mark on his record. As long as he kept his nose clean, and didn't get any more of those, his career would be fine. Since he knew the actual purpose of the test, and his teammates didn't, things should turn out fine in that endeavor. Thinking about the test that was to come reminded him of the first time he had taken the final genin test. The test was over and his new sensei had told them that they'd passed. Does anyone know what the purpose of this test was? Asked a man whom he wasn't sure whether to call Shimura-sensei or Tetsuo-sensei, since he didn't know what sort of person he was yet. He didn't know what the test could have been for other than to screw with the kids who just graduated, and from his teammates' blank looks, he could guess that they didn't know either. Teamwork, his new sensei said when all three of them failed to answer. Up until now, you have been tested individually, and have gotten by on your own merits. In the shinobi ranks, however, ninja are most often sent on missions in teams. To succeed, the team has to work together, and anyone who goes off on their own not only puts themselves at risk, but puts their entire team at risk as well. This test was intended to weed out those who would not be able to work together with their teammates. In this test, one's own self-interests are put at stake, making it more difficult to work as a team, especially considering the fact that you have not been ordered to do so. I told you that you had to catch me before 10, and that the last person to catch me would be the one who failed. Had you just scrabbled around individually trying to be the first, or at the very least the second to catch me, I would not have let you do so. While you could have done a better job of working together, you did so nonetheless. Uzumaki here set up a number of ingenious traps, and you Suzume-chan and Satoshi-kun worked together to corner me in them and capture me. His new sensei continued. He decided that it would be a very wise thing to say nothing at this point. If sensei said that they had worked together, they had worked together, and he wouldn't say otherwise. Because of this, you have passed, and I am proud of you all. His new sensei said. His sensei was proud of him. His sensei was proud of him. He had taken the test before when he joined Team 5, knew the purpose of the test, and Kakashi knew that he knew. If Sasuke and Sakura worked together, he would at least have to pretend to be making some small effort to pass while subtly trying to break the team apart without Kakashi noticing. But if his would-be teammates did what he thought they would do, which was what about 2/3 of the teams usually ended up doing every year, he wouldn't have to do anything more than sit back and not clue them in. Grumbling, he pulled himself out of his musings over the unwanted test and headed out the door. Even though he had a sneaking suspicion that Kakashi would be running on Kakashi Time Plus in order to rile his new recruits, and make them even more ill-tempered when the time for the test came, he set out to reach the designated meeting place near the memorial on time. Instead of taking the time to prepare breakfast, he took a granola bar with him, and a spare for later because there was no way in hell that he was going to go all morning without eating, and because he'd been run until he puked once before, and he knew it wasn't fun if you had a lot in your stomach when that happened. He wouldn't put it past Kakashi to run them until they puked as part of the test. Since he had a great deal of stamina, Kakashi would more than likely run him that much harder than the others if he did so. When he reached the meeting point, he found Sasuke and Sakura already there. Sakura looked like she hadn't slept in a week and Sasuke looked rather tired as well. Apparently, from the looks of it, they had both individually pulled an all-nighter. He'd pulled all-nighters before, and wasn't as affected by them, but he'd gotten some sleep last night, so he felt more put out than tired like his teammates were, as he was sure he'd be stuck waiting for Kakashi again. He remembered what waiting for Kakashi had been like during the week the man had taught him the Kage Bunshin. Every day that he'd had those lessons with Kakashi, he had sat there increasingly impatiently for hours on end until the man had finally arrived. The first day had been the worst. If Tetsuo-sensei hadn't warned him about the man's habits, he would have thought that his sensei had been pulling a trick on him. In fact, he had almost believed he'd been tricked by the time Kakashi had finally deigned to show up. While Tetsuo-sensei had been rather nice compared to most of the rest of the village, he hadn't liked him all that much in the beginning. Tetsuo-sensei had eventually warmed up to him as time went on though. As he watched Sasuke and Sakura yawn as they struggled to remain awake, his hands itched to set up traps all around the designated training ground, and he knew that he had at least 2 hours in which he could do so. However, he had decided not to make any effort on this no matter how much it stung his professional pride. So, instead of littering the area with a number of traps a jounin would be hard-pressed to avoid, he settled down with the books he'd brought with him. He started with a reread of Uchiha Madara's A Treatise on Traps. In the early days of Konoha, back before the Shodai Hokage had been selected, Uchiha Madara had written several books for the new ninja library, hoping to curry favor with the shinobi who were flocking to the newly forming village and be elected to the position of Hokage himself. After Senju Hashirama was selected to be the Shodai Hokage by the will of both the people of the village and the daimyo of Fire Country because he'd practically built the village's infrastructure from the ground up single-handedly, Madara had tried to take the Hokage's hat in battle. The Uchiha had not been victorious, and had died in the titanic struggle that had formed the Valley of the End, leaving behind a legacy of a mostly forgotten series of rather insightful if somewhat boring books on the ninja arts. After reading it, he was convinced that the trap book would have been the standard textbook for trap specialists if the man who'd written it hadn't fallen so far out of favor. It was brilliant, easy to understand despite being a bit boring and long-winded, and some of the traps it showed you how to make were rather ingenious if somewhat dated. Even with all of the books he'd brought with him including Madara's traps treatise, the wait was a long and boring one. Kakashi finally showed up with 2 bento, an alarm clock while he was in the middle of the field cooking guide which he'd picked up because he really didn't want to be stuck eating only field rations when he left the village on missions since Satoshi wasn't there to cook for him. Seeing the bento boxes, the reason the man had told them not to eat breakfast suddenly hit him. The bastard had wanted them to fight over lunch. "You're late!" Sakura, who had spent the last 4 hours staring at him and whimpering again, screeched. Considering how scared of him she'd been since the day he'd snapped and told Sakura that if she tried to hit him again he'd break her arm, he was surprised that she'd even had the courage to admit disliking him yesterday, especially as vehemently as she had. In contrast, Sasuke however had pretended not to react to both Sakura's yell and Kakashi's lateness. The boy had some pretty good acting skills. Either that, or he was extremely good at denial, which could be a serious problem. He himself had refrained from reacting much, but that was because he'd gotten used to Kakashi's tardiness long ago, and he'd heard worse yelling around the village. "So what was it this time?" he asked before the man could give one of his stock excuses. "I know it wasn't the memorial since I can see it from here." "So what was it? Porn? You kill another expensive alarm clock and have to give it a decent burial? Or did you make those lunches yourself?" "The alarm clock actually," Kakashi replied as he held up the shiny new alarm clock he'd brought with him. That clock was most likely going to suffer a most gruesome end on Kakashi's nightstand after it was done being used as a timer for whatever test Kakashi had planned. When it came to the more experienced ninjas, alarm clocks usually didn't last too long. After a while, certain reactions become instinctive in regards to loud noises going off practically right next to one's ear. Most ninja got around this little problem by training themselves to wake up at a certain time. When it came to some of the more stubborn ninja with a little extra disposable income however, he understood though, he'd actually broken the alarm clock he'd had since he was a little kid shortly after he came back from Kiri. The kunai jamming its inner workings had made it completely unsalvageable, and he'd been forced to purchase another one. Fortunately, the nightmares had faded a bit, and he hadn't broken any since then. After setting his doomed clock aside, Kakashi explained the rules of his test which involved bells. When Kakashi had mentioned coming at him with the intent to kill, he felt a surge of some emotion he couldn't name because it seemed to be a mix of several emotions at the same time. The last time he'd gone at someone with the intent of killing them, rather than in defense of self or others, he had done so, and he'd been suffering from nightmares ever since. While he knew that Kakashi could beat him hands down if there was a fight, there was still the worry that something would happen. When the test finally started several hours later than had originally been scheduled, Sasuke and Sakura did as he had anticipated and promptly split up without a word or any covert signals or gestures indicating planning of some sort passing between the two of them as they did so. Realizing that he'd been given his out, he himself moved to the trees in order to find a location in which to kill time until the test was over. As soon as he found a sweet little hiding spot, he trapped it in case Kakashi or one of his new teammates showed up, and pulled out a book and the extra granola bar. He had learned long ago to always keep at least a little food on him so he didn't end up starving if there was an accident with the supplies. He'd also learned to keep his granola bars in a separate pocket from his emergency rations bars as both were roughly the same shape and size. On more than one occasion, he'd accidentally handed out one of the latter when he'd intended to give one of the former, and had accidentally grabbed one of the ration bars for himself when he meant to grab one of the granola ones. Granola bars were sort of sweet, and emergency rations bars, to put it mildly, tasted like crap. Absent-mindedly opening and taking a bite of the one you didn't want while absorbed in another activity was an unpleasant experience. Eventually, after Sakura screamed indicating that Kakashi had done something that had taken her out of the running and Sasuke got his ass handed to him from the sound of it, Kakashi made his way over to him. When he noticed the man was nearby, he casually pretended to ignore the man's presence while preparing to fight if necessary. Instead of attacking him as he half expected, Kakashi just stood there and sighed. "What are you doing, Naruto?" Kakashi asked, looking up into the tree in which he was perched, waiting for the other two to get a clue, since the test was for their benefit. He replied, "As soon as they pull their heads out of their asses, they can easily come and find me, whatever," Kakashi said as he hopped into a nearby tree and pulled out his own book, clearly not impressed with Sasuke's and Sakura's performances either. By the time the alarm went off indicating that the test was over, Sasuke and Sakura, who'd been working separately, still hadn't gotten the idea of what the test was about. Sakura was tied to the post since, despite the fact he'd put absolutely no effort into passing the test, Kakashi was well aware of the fact that trying to tie him up would be a futile effort, and since Sasuke had actually made a pretty good try at getting the bells. As soon as Kakashi ordered them not to feed Sakura and vanished to a spot nearby to make sure they were following orders or whatever, he cut Sakura loose. As far as he was concerned, the test was done, everyone failed, and he could go home. As soon as the girl was free, he tossed her his lunch since he planned on seeing if Tetsuo-sensei was in the mood for barbecue, as today definitely was not an Ichiraku day, and the girl had looked and sounded as if she had been starving all morning. As soon as he started walking away, Kakashi's shoes shined in with a thunderous expression on his face and a genjutsu that showed an ominous stormy sky complete with overly dramatic flashes of lightning stretching across the scenery behind him. Apparently, the man had taken some genjutsu tips from Mato guy whose seaside sunset was rapidly becoming infamous. "And just where do you think you're going?" the man asked. "The test is over and he started, explaining why he was ditching his new and now former teammates. "Past," Kakashi said in an overly cheerful manner as the genjutsu dissipated, revealing the sunny autumn sky. "What?" he asked, completely surprised. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be happening. While he stood there staring at Kakashi in open-mouthed shock, Kakashi launched into an explanation of how the team had passed because he chucked his lunch at Sakura out of pity for the girl, and all he could think was crap if he'd known that his act of charity would have had this result. He would have taken the lunch with him and dumped it somewhere. Near the end of the lecture, Kakashi said something he thought was particularly wise, and therefore most likely borrowed from someone else. "Those who break the rules are trash. Those who abandon their teammates are worse than trash," Kakashi had said. Considering his, Sasuke and Sakura's behavior during the test, he could already say that his new and unwanted team was currently worse than trash. The only way to go from there was up. Right. Tucci frowned when he saw the blonde boy coming up the street. One of his best customers, who happened to be the son of at least one of and quite possibly two of his late best customers, had abruptly stopped coming, and he wanted to know why, especially considering the fact that the last time he'd done something like that was when he was recovering from some serious trauma. It wasn't just that Naruto's absence was putting his shinobi customers on edge for some reason. He was slightly worried for the boy, and had been rather worried about him as well. "Hey Naruto!" he called, getting the boy's attention. "Yeah, old man?" Naruto called back as he headed over to the stand. "Why haven't you been coming?" he asked. "I know it can't be missions, since I am seeing you around the village while she was making deliveries." Naruto sat down more out of habit than anything, and began to tell him exactly why he hadn't been coming by lately. The boy's sitting down had been exactly what he'd been hoping for, since he knew from experience that once he sat down, the boy wouldn't leave without eating. Without being asked, he began preparing the noodles for the boy's first bowl. He knew from experience that if he gave the boy one free bowl, he would always eat more. If he did not eat more right then for whatever reason, then he would come back at a later date and do so. It had been a free bowl of ramen that had netted the boy as a regular customer years ago. "They put me on a different team a few weeks back," Naruto said, sounding unhappy. That was it. Though he and his daughter were civilians, his father had been a shinobi, like the vast majority of his customer base were. After spending so much time around shinobi, he understood some of the issues that came with the job that he'd decided long ago was not for him. Naruto's problem, though highly uncommon during peacetime, was unfortunately a rather common one during times of war. The academy was like an elementary school with weapons. Some kids become fond of the instructors there and made friends for life there, and some kids didn't, but the genin teams were a different issue entirely. In a properly run genin team, the bond between the genin and their jounin sensei was a rather close one, approaching that of one between a parent and a child. Genin often stayed close to their jounin sensei and their teammates long after they had advanced to chunin, or even jounin themselves, unless one or the other ended up dying. Sometimes, however, a disaster of some sort occurred, and a genin would be forced to accept a new team and call a new person sensei. When this happened, the genin in question often had a hard time adjusting to the person who, in their view, had usurped the role of sensei, and their new teammates at first. Eventually, things either got better, or the genin got transferred. But Naruto's placement with a different instructor didn't make sense. Shimura Tetsuo was an active-duty jounin in good health who could easily have taken a pair of new genin from the fall class to fill out his team to replace the two who had advanced to chunin, as he had been talking about doing at the end of the summer exams. There couldn't have been a falling out between Naruto and his sensei, since he'd seen Tetsuo yesterday, and he seemed fine with Naruto if somewhat upset about something that pertained to the boy. Any reasons he could think of that would necessitate Naruto being forcibly removed from the Shimura's care would have quite likely ended with the man being in prison or executed. Since the man was alive, free, and still a jounin, none of those things could have happened. "You're not too happy with your new team, I take it," he said, hoping that Naruto would provide more information so he could solve this little puzzle that was frankly beginning to worry him a little as well. "Not really. I'll work with them because it's my duty," but Naruto replied. "Kakashi was an okay teacher when he taught me the Kage Bunshin, but he's not Tetsuo-sensei, and he doesn't really have time for me because he's stuck fixing whatever the hell the academy did wrong with the other two. I know for a fact that whatever it wasn't Ichiraku-sensei's fault because he did a good job with me. I heard somewhere that Mizuki jerk who tried stealing from the Hokage had been a teaching assistant, so it was probably his doing." Now that it was done cooking, he set the bowl of Naruto's usual down in front of the boy, and the boy began to eat, continuing his story as he did so. As he listened, he found himself wondering what the heck was going on. Why would Kakashi take Naruto? By all accounts, the shinobi who had been coming here off and on since he was a little shrimp hadn't been interested in taking on any students. He'd been hearing rumors recently that the man had been given some sort of bribe to make him take a team this year though. Had Naruto been the bribe? Why would Naruto be considered an acceptable bribe in the first place? Ever since Kakashi could barely see over the counter, the only person he'd seemed to care about was the yondaime. Well, it would seem that a certain theory of his had indeed been correct. He had speculated about it for years, ever since the Hokage had shown up with a blonde-haired, blue-eyed, chubby-cheeked toddler who bore the surname of a certain redhead that Minato had brought here on a couple of dinner dates before he became Hokage, but nothing had seemed to confirm or deny his suspicions. Until now, that was. It would seem that he was right. Naruto was the son of two of his best customers, one of whom had pissed off a shitload of people and died, leaving the boy completely unprotected. And Sakura's totally scared of me, but I guess that it was sort of my fault since I had threatened to break her arm when she tried to hit me. Naruto continued between bites. I hadn't been in a good mood that day, so I was a little harsher than usual when I decided to teach her why it wasn't a good idea to try to hit me. Noticing that Naruto's free bowl was almost finished, he began to get Naruto's second bowl ready. Things were getting back to normal now. Something just didn't seem right when he didn't see Naruto's smiling face at least a couple times a week when he wasn't on missions. And it wasn't just him who felt that way either. He had been losing several shinobi customers who had avoided his stand because something had seemed off as well. They should come back now that Naruto was back. Konohamaru sighed in relief. Since Naruto was talking now, it would be safe to approach him. Over the last few weeks, Naruto had been in an odd, grumbling bad mood which was different from his normal bad days which had been happening far less frequently lately. Today, however, when he had first seen Naruto after he had gotten off his D rank of the day, he had noticed that it had been looking to be a bad day. He could tell even before he'd seen his boss's face just by the way he was walking. However, instead of remaining in sullen solitary silence and snapping at all who approached the way he usually did on a bad day, Naruto's mood had almost magically changed after he'd had a talk with the proprietor of Ichiraku and a couple bowls of ramen. When Naruto had settled his bill with the proprietor of Ichiraku Ramen and continued on his way, made his move. He wanted to do more than play today since he'd recently been informed that come January, he'd be attending the academy rather than being exclusively trained by Ebisu as he had been for the last couple of years. While as he'd been repeatedly informed that was a good thing, he was still very nervous. Naruto had already attended the academy, and would therefore know what to expect and be able to tell him. Naruto had taught him a great deal over the last several months, including the fact that there was no shortcut to becoming Hokage. Those who try to take what they see as the easy way to be Hokages have more often than not get hurt or killed. That had been true in the days of Senju Hashirama, and it was true now. The road to becoming Hokage was a long and hard one, and the academy was one of the steps along the way. With a cry of "Hey boss!" He rounded the corner after Naruto. Perhaps after they got all of the serious stuff out of the way, they could play ninja. He learned some of the coolest stuff while playing ninja, like the Oiroke Jutsu. Naruto had not been having a very good day. It had all started early in the morning when he decided to empty out his closet before training because it was looking a little full. After clearing out all of the trash, he started pulling out the clothing to check and see what fit and what didn't. The stuff that didn't would be going to the orphanage's charity bin, which had been where he had gotten a great deal of his clothes before the academy. Usually, he wore his clothes out before he outgrew them, but there was some stuff that had been in the back of the closet for a long time. It had been while he had been doing this cleaning that he had found the sandals buried at the back of the closet underneath an old shirt. They were much too small for him now, as his feet had grown a couple of sizes in the past year, and he couldn't have worn them again even if he had wanted to. Not that he'd ever wanted to see them again, much less wear them. The first thing he noticed about them when he finally processed what he was looking at was the fact that they still smelled faintly of old blood. His first thought had been to throw them away and forget about them. Years of conditioning had kept him from throwing away anything that could potentially be useful. He couldn't think of how they would be useful though. They didn't fit, were no good for traps, and brought back memories he would rather have stayed buried. In the end, figuring that they'd be useful for someone else, he dumped them in the orphanage pile. To make matters worse, training that day had gone abysmally as usual. The team-building exercises were little more than a farce, as neither Sasuke nor Sakura had wanted to work with him, and frankly the only reason he'd been willing to work with them was because it was his duty. Had they been out in the field, he wouldn't have left them behind, but he wasn't certain that they wouldn't leave him behind. The moniker of team was a sad joke when it came to their group. Sasuke had wanted to do everything by himself, and Sakura had gone along with Sasuke, whom she was completely obsessed over. Taijutsu training had followed the failed team-building exercise, which had even Kakashi about ready to scream in frustration. The less said about that, the better. Sasuke was good at taijutsu, nearly at Suzume's level, and therefore this team's taijutsu specialist. Taijutsu most definitely wasn't his own specialty, however. He could do the standard academy form thanks to Tetsuo-sensei, but when he was forced to fight, he usually went with a style that worked for him, which Tetsuo-sensei constantly lamented over, calling it a combination between the academy form and a bar brawl without the bar. Kakashi wasn't too happy with his style either, but had remarked that it seemed surprisingly effective for its purposes and would be much better if he worked on his speed. In contrast to Sasuke's excellent example of a bastardized version of the Uchiha fighting style, and his rather unorthodox style, Sakura's style was textbook perfect academy, and a rather weak example of it at that. Once again, Kakashi had been forced to attempt to begin to deal with Sakura's inadequacies, and therefore had set him and Sasuke to sparring once more. He hated sparring with Sasuke. No matter what he did, even if he won the match, Sasuke would accuse him of holding back and get upset. The thing was, he hadn't really been holding back. He performed much better in a real battle situation when he was pumped up on adrenaline and whatnot, and actually aiming to kill, but for training purposes, he wasn't holding back. He told Sasuke this many times, but the boy refused to believe him. This refusal to believe him always led to an unpleasant argument, and today was no exception. After the day's training, which had left all of them in a foul mood, had come a mission. Normally, those weren't too bad, even though going from C-ranked missions to DS had practically felt like being demoted, but it seemed that today Kakashi had asked the mission's assignment desk to pick the worst one possible in order to drive his team together through shared trauma. If that had been what Kakashi had been up to when he'd selected the mission, his plan had backfired spectacularly. However, as babysitting a spoiled 2-year-old who had only just begun potty training couldn't come close to comparing to watching comrades get killed, or coming home to discover that your entire family has been murdered by your older brother on the trauma scale. After the mission was over, he'd gone home and gathered up the orphanage charity pile he'd set aside that morning, being careful to place the sandals where he couldn't see them, and hauled it over to the orphanage. The orphanage itself brought back bad memories of a different sort. While he hadn't been abused there, he had been isolated, and had many painful memories of being alone despite the fact that he'd been surrounded by other children. He'd been about to dump the pile of clothes into the charity bin when one of the staff came over and took it from him, looking at him suspiciously the entire time. This was par for the course for one of them, however, since they had constantly blamed him for crap he hadn't done while he'd been living here, and looked about ready to accuse him of something even now. After carefully examining each article of clothing, the woman either rejected it or neatly folded it and put it in a pile. Everything would have been fine if she hadn't put the damn sandals on top of the pile, adding those memories to the unpleasant memories that he associated with this place. He didn't say anything as he left though. It'd just make things worse if he did. He'd been on his way back home from the orphanage when old man Tucci had called out to him. He liked Tucci. The man had been nice to him, and had served him for as long as he could remember, even back before Ichiraku had started treating him to ramen. He remembered Ichiraku's slight surprise over the fact that he already knew the place when he had taken him here for the first time. He shouldn't have been so startled that he knew this place, considering how well known it was. Maybe it had been surprise over the fact that Tucci had served him without fuss, unlike most restaurant owners in Konoha who either kicked him out or served him last. Tucci had given him a sympathetic ear, some good advice, and a free bowl of ramen. All three of these worked towards picking his mood up significantly. His mood raised even more after he'd finished his meal and heard Konohamaru call out to him. Konohamaru was a good kid who always brightened what would have otherwise been a dull day, Hatake Kakashi sighed. It had been over 4.5 months since he'd gotten his team, and throughout that entire time, it had refused to bond into something resembling a cohesive whole, or at the very least, something resembling his second genin team, which had been somewhat unbalanced yet still managed to work somehow, not letting their frequent arguments get in the way of their missions. For some strange reason, it wasn't a well-known fact that he had been the only survivor of 2 teams under Minato-sensei. When he was 5, he and a pair of 10-year-olds had been given to Minato-sensei, who had been in his late teens at the time, to be his first genin team. 8 months after their graduation, Minato-sensei had entered them in the Chunin exams to see what they were up against, and hopefully do much better next time. He and his team did well enough back then, but he had been the only one on the team to make Chunin. Before they could get another chance at a promotion, his teammates had been killed in the war on what had been supposed to be a routine mission when a well-hidden trap had gone off, catching his 2 teammates in it. For the next few years after that, it had been just him and Minato-sensei. When he was 9, Minato had taken on a pair of academy graduates who were his own age in spite of his protests. They became Team 7, and they had stayed together even after the other 2 had become Chunin as well. In the end, it had taken death to separate them. First came Obito's when the other boy had died, saving his life. Then came Rin's when he couldn't see any other way out of the situation they were in, and had fully expected to join her soon. Then came Minato-sensei's on that dark night when the Kyuubi had been unleashed upon the village. In the early days after Rin and Obito had been put on the team, things had been somewhat strained. He'd been the aloof one, much like Sasuke, because he'd closed himself off to just about everyone except Minato-sensei after his father had died. Rin had been the one with the crush on the aloof one, much like Sakura was now, and Obito had been the one to ease the tension of difficult missions with humor that was both intentional and unintentional. Eventually, after a great deal of struggle, they had found balance, and had even become friends before it all ended. With this team, however, there wasn't even the precarious balance his Team 7 had had in the beginning, when he had viewed Obito and Rin as a pair of interlopers who were taking Minato-sensei's attention away from him. While his students could now perform the team formations flawlessly, and complete group tasks when ordered to do so, there was something completely missing, and he knew exactly what it was. There was no laughter, no joy, not even a vague sense of camaraderie, earned through shared trials or otherwise. While there was a Kakashi and a Rin, there was no Obito to brighten the day and make them stop taking themselves so seriously. In fact, the teammate most likely to have been the one to provide good cheer had been in a foul and surly mood for several months, and was starting to show signs of extreme restlessness. He could understand Naruto's restlessness, as he was feeling it too. He hadn't been this inactive in a long time, and hadn't stayed within the boundaries of Konoha for this long in years, and the last time he'd done so had been because he'd been dragged back to the village mostly dead, and had needed a long time to recuperate. With Naruto going completely stir-crazy, odds were that there would be no meaningful progress anytime soon. Perhaps, what the entire team needed was to get away from it all. A change of scenery would do them some good, and give them a chance at a fresh start. In peacetime, AC rank was practically a paid vacation, and a vacation was exactly what this team needed. Naruto had taken C ranks before, so there was a good chance that the Hokage would allow his team to take one now, despite how recently 2 of his students had graduated, as there was usually at least a 6-month wait before C ranks were handed out to rookie teams. With his mind made up, he resolved to request a C rank after the team's current mission ended. Now to catch that stupid cat. Why had he signed the team up for this one? Oh yeah, shared trauma, which was rather pointless since both Sasuke and Naruto had experienced worse, much, much worse. He winced as a particularly nasty swear word came in over his radio headset. Great. The perpetual argument between Sasuke and Naruto had already started, and it wasn't the nice friendly kind between rivals like the ones he and Obito used to have. How the hell they managed to successfully complete missions while tearing at each other's throats, he didn't know. Naruto stared at Kakashi in barely restrained shock as the man requested a C rank mission. While the opportunity to get out of the village was appreciated since he'd been feeling boxed in for a while, he had to wonder what the man had been thinking. Tetsuo-sensei had waited almost a year before requesting a C rank for his old team because he'd wanted to make sure that the team could work almost seamlessly as a whole before he took them outside the village and into potential danger. What happened in River Country was another story entirely, but the dynamic on this team, to put it mildly, sucked. However, they were worse than a team that consisted of members of clans that were going through a 3-way feud. If there was some sort of incident, there was a good chance that all of the cooperative team training that they had done would go flying out the window. Based on his attitude and past behavior, Sasuke would more than likely race into the fray and face it head-on without pausing to consider the danger or even a possible plan, while Sakura screamed for him to save her, and he'd probably be forced to rescue them both. If Kakashi wasn't forced to rescue all 3 of them, that is. Fortunately, things didn't usually go wrong on C ranks during peacetime, and they usually ended up being more of an advanced training trip for Genin, the equivalent of D ranks for Chunin, and something like a milk run for Jounin. Unfortunately for him and his team, however, the Chunin always got first pick and took all of the better missions, leaving the more than slightly sucky ones to the more experienced genin teams who came in to get what was left over. As a general rule of thumb, Jounin escorted princesses, Chunin escorted merchants, and Genin escorted brats. For some reason that probably had to do with the fact that the tobacco in his pipe didn't exactly smell like tobacco, the Hokage complied with Kakashi's request, and he was now stuck on a last pick of the day mission, which he just knew was going to royally suck since both all of the Chunin and the other Genin teams who'd dropped by earlier had already rejected it. Great. Things just kept getting better and better. Well, there was one high point of the mission, and that was that he'd be able to get a chance to see where his mother was born, or rather the ruins of the village in which his mother had been born. Wave had once been Whirlpool before it had been reorganized following the invasion during the Second War, and what was left of Yuzushiobikyu was somewhere in that tiny country. He hadn't really been expecting much when it came to the person that his team was going to escort, and even those lowered expectations hadn't been met. When the old man walked in and started insulting everybody, he just knew that he was going to be that kind of drunk. Ninja often got stuck with two kinds of drunk: 1. The overly friendly kind of drunk that was a constant annoyance, and 2. The less than friendly kind that was a constant test of one's self-control. As they say, however, the customer is always right, and if you go killing the customers for pissing you off, they'll start taking their money elsewhere, and you'll start starving because you'll be out of business. After being put on a last pick of the day mission and meeting his drunken client, it was only natural that he'd been in a decidedly homicidal mood when he went home to pack. If it hadn't been for Suzum teaching him how to make storage seals, choosing what to bring with him would have been a much more difficult decision. Aside from his storage seals and explosive tags, he was pretty much hopeless at seals. Sure, he could recognize them for what they were, and make an educated guess at their purpose, but making them himself was almost completely beyond him. It had been through sheer repetition that he had become as proficient at the seals he was good at making as he was. Once he was done packing and hiding his valuables in case Satoshi dropped by while he was away, he left his apartment key, rooftop greenhouse key, and the list of trap locations with Suzum so she could tend to his plants while he was gone. The reason he'd chosen Suzum was because he was reasonably certain that with her, he would come back to find everything where he left it. With Satoshi, he'd be spending his mission pay getting his more important belongings out of Haku, as the boy still hadn't learned his lesson and had to be a gambling-addicted kleptomaniac or something. With Tetsuo-sensei, he'd probably come home to find that the man had taken the opportunity to retaliate for one of his more good-natured pranks. He'd been stuck with purple hair for a week after the last time Tetsuo-sensei had gotten back at him for a prank. Sasuke growled as he packed for his mission, not in the least bit happy with the situation. Since they would be leaving bright and early the next morning, he wouldn't have time to do it then. He was going on his first C-ranked mission, and while that would normally be considered a good thing as it was a sign that he was moving up in the world if only very slightly, he was only going because Kakashi thought that he was bored. Contrary to the way things should be, he wasn't taking a more difficult mission on the basis of his own merit but because Kakashi had wanted to please that boy. He had worked hard for years, trained for endless hours, studied for days on end, and in under an hour, that boy came along and made a mockery of everything he'd worked for, and showed him how little he had gained through his efforts. What was worse was that boy constantly refused to give him his all so he could grow stronger, surpass him, and prove his superiority. Despite all of his attempts to get him to do otherwise, that boy refused to take him seriously, treating him like he was something to play with to fill the empty hours while he was held back. To add insult to injury, every time that boy held back against him, he would make some stupid excuse for why he hadn't taken him seriously, just like he used to do back at the academy. Since they were usually about him when he was in the vicinity, and often brought up things he didn't want to think about, he usually ignored the whispers around town. But sometime around January, he'd heard the same thing being whispered over and over by the shinobi he'd passed, something that, rather than being about him as usual, was about that boy. For several weeks, he had heard constant repetitions of why isn't he in the Chunin exams, and ever since the Chunin exams had completely passed until July, he'd been hearing he should be a Chunin already. This of course was all Kakashi's fault. The whispers, the fact that boy was playing with him, the insults to his pride, everything. For whatever reason, Kakashi was holding that boy back, and he was stuck paying for it. Sakura brushed her hair before bed. She was exceedingly nervous about the mission that was ahead of her. While it wouldn't be her first time outside of Konoha, it would be her first time as a ninja, and her first time in a foreign country, and she'd be going there with Naruto. While they were gone, there would only be Sasuke and Kakashi there to save her should Naruto finally snap like he had been looking like he was about to do for months. Naruto had apologized for the threat he made shortly after they became teammates, and told her that he would never harm his comrades, but still, the fear was there. She had read the statistics on shinobi who had suffered a break in the field and attacked everyone around them instead of just the enemy. Being a ninja was a high-risk, an extremely stressful job which came with a burnout rate that was much higher than in just about every other career field. The number of psychotic breaks suffered by shinobi were proportionately higher as well. Over the last few months she had also read up on ways to detect the signs that a shinobi was under an unusually high amount of pressure, and therefore at risk of suffering a psychotic break. Naruto was displaying several of these signs, and had been displaying them for as long as he'd been on the team. While snappishness by itself was considered a minor character flaw, snappishness combined with extreme irritability and restlessness were warning signs of something even more serious. Naruto may have promised never to harm her or any of his other comrades, but that was no guarantee. He had snapped before, and he could do it again at any time, and she could quite easily be one of the casualties due to proximity. After she finished brushing her hair, she checked her pack once more. She had packed it according to the academy guide, so it should be fine, but it was something to do to keep her mind off other things. After she finished checking her pack, she climbed under the covers of her bed and hoped she would get at least some sleep before she was due to leave for her first C-ranked mission. Tazuna gulped down his drink, hoping to drown out the overwhelming feeling of guilt he was currently experiencing. While he had never been a shinobi, his Uzumaki cousin on his mother's side had been, and he had learned some things from the older boy before he had died on a mission. One of the things he'd learned that had stuck with him over the years was how missions were handed out. When he'd fudged a mission ranking on his request, he had fully expected to get a team of Chunin. C ranks were usually reserved for Chunin, and only after the Chunin had made their pick were any remaining C ranks given to the more experienced Genin teams. Instead of being given a team of Chunin who might have been able to deal with Gato's mercenaries in a pinch, he'd been given a Genin team that looked as if it had just graduated from the academy. While a Genin team had a Jounin on it, which would normally be a plus since Jounin were rumored to be worth 10 Chunin, the man would be handicapped by his need to protect his Genin, and wouldn't nearly be as effective as he would otherwise have been. This was especially bad in this situation because the unsuspecting team would be walking into a great deal more danger than they signed up for. It was too late to turn back now, however. What was done was done. If he went back and admitted his lie, he and his people would not get the help they needed, and there was a possibility that he would become a guest of the torture and interrogations department, as shinobi villages didn't take too kindly to people deliberately misranking their missions, and tended to become suspicious of their motives for doing so. He had come to Konoha because they had once been an ally and, in hindsight, that had made his betrayal only that much worse. So, he drank to forget the guilt of his actions as well as the worry over what would happen to his family and friends if help didn't come. The team had been several hours out when the first bit of trouble began. When the fighting started, Sasuke had raced headlong into danger without a plan after Kakashi had Kawarimi'd out just as Naruto had expected he would, and Sakura held back too frightened to scream. As he'd half expected he would have to, Naruto had been forced to come up with a plan on the fly to deal with this. Eventually, he and Sasuke, who had been pretty much acting on his own while he compensated, had brought the two renegade Chunin down, and Kakashi had learned who their target was. When Kakashi had confronted Tazuna about his deception regarding the mission's actual difficulty, Tazuna had informed him that Wave had been virtually taken over by a shipping magnate who had bought up all of the ports, and that he was a threat to the man's rule because he'd been building a bridge to the mainland that he had refused to sell. The shipping magnate, whose name was Gato, had arranged to have him killed in hopes of forcing his heirs to sell his shares in a bridge that he actually pretty much owned in name alone, as he had contractually promised all of the shares to the workers after the completion of the bridge in exchange for their work, as he had only been able to pay them very little in the way of wages. Honestly, thanks to the incident with the demon brothers, Naruto's first instinct upon hearing this had been to turn back, but he knew that he couldn't turn his back on his mother's former homeland and say, well, the mission's beyond my pay grade. So while he had been with Tetsuo-sensei, the man had made him read the newspaper every morning in order to improve his reading skills and make him get into the habit of keeping himself up to date on current events, which he had previously been almost completely oblivious to. While reading the paper, he had occasionally come across stories about stalled investigations into Gato's businesses, including a recent article about a minor port town in the land of tea that the man had recently bought outright. While reading these stories, he had read between the lines as Tetsuo-sensei had taught him to, and he had come to the conclusion that the man was a complete jerk who destroyed every place in which he set up business. Apparently, his mother's former homeland was next on the list. So, when Kakashi actually took a vote rather than unilaterally deciding on their course of action as a jounin in charge of a team of genin was supposed to do, he found himself voting to continue onward. Even if it hadn't been his mother's homeland, he would have wanted to do something about what was going on there. If people like Gato were allowed to go unchecked, they ended up causing trouble in one's own backyard rather than the neighbors, and Wave was pretty damn close to fire country. Close enough to build a bridge to. In fact, he would have to start planning how he would be dealing with what lay in wait for him and his team on the road ahead soon. He was best at planning on the fly, but he wasn't too bad at long-range planning either. Tetsuo-sensei had taught him how to use his skill in planning pranks to plan battles beforehand, and that had helped him greatly in the past when dealing with bandits. While no plan survived contact with the enemy, the general shape of the plan usually did, and if he had a general idea where his teammates would be ahead of time, he would have a general idea as to where on the battlefield to set up traps on the fly if he got the opportunity. It wouldn't do to catch your teammates in traps meant for the enemy after all. The kind of battle where he would have to fight his way through completely capable opponents because he hadn't been able to set any traps up beforehand was his least favorite kind of fight. Beggars can't be choosers, and it was going to be the sort of fight he and his team were going to be engaged in when the next ninja came after Tazuna's head. However, he had been right back at the mission assignment desk. This mission was going to suck royally. Even though it was well out of his way, Haku had made it a point to pass by this place whenever he was in wave. Zabuza had shown it to him years ago, when they had passed through the small island country on the way to the mainland when they had fled from Kiri after the failed coup. To Zabuza, this place had been a reminder of how greatness could fall with few to mark its passing. To him, though, this place had held a haunting and melancholy beauty that had spoken of how quickly things could end when you least expect them to. Though some household goods still remained moldering in homes that had not been lived in decades, time and rain had washed away all of the blood and most of the memories of this place. And now, pretty much all that was left to mark the existence of the once proud Yuzushigekyo was a series of partially cannibalized ruins that stretched down to the sea. He could not stay here long this time, however, because their target was due to arrive in wave soon, and he and Zabuza were going to intercept him before he reached his home. Despite their employer's suggestions, they would not be attacking the target's family unless it became absolutely necessary to do so. 1. It had not been included in their contract, and 2. As well as being wrong for several reasons, it was also the sort of action that would breed ill will amongst the locals, which would in turn make them more willing to cooperate with any hunter Nin who might have picked up their trail. As long as he and Zabuza left the locals alone, the locals would pretty much ignore their presence. That was the usual arrangement that people outside of the hidden villages tended to have with missing Nin unless the nuke Nin in question went and started making trouble. There were more than enough problems in life without attracting attention to oneself by turning someone who was probably only rogue due to some political issue over to the authorities. If they weren't hurting anybody, it usually wasn't worth the trouble. Staring at the ruins again? Zabuza asked, when he finally rejoined him. I was Zabuza-sama, he replied as he picked up his mask and equipment pouch and prepared to depart. I honestly don't know what you see in them, Zabuza muttered as he checked his own equipment. Not that there was much of it, because times had gotten a little tough lately, and it was rather difficult to find a reasonably priced supplier who would sell to missing Nin without turning them in. As soon as they were ready to go, they headed to the pre-selected ambush point and settled down for what could be a long wait. Most of the time on these types of missions, there was a lot of hurry up and wait, as targets had sometimes passed by ninja who had based the timing of their ambush on their target's ETA and delayed arriving accordingly, only to find that the target in question had already passed through the pre-selected zone. Therefore, it was always prudent to arrive early to an ambush in case the target arrived earlier than expected. While he waited for the target to show, he killed some time by feeding Yuki, who was feeling restless at being cooped up in a tiny cage rather than in the small pen he'd built for the rabbit when they had arrived in Wave a couple weeks back. When the time came, Yuki would be released for Zabuza-sama to switch with if necessary. Until then, the rabbit was both his pet and his responsibility. Kakashi sighed as he watched his team, who were bickering once more as they trailed behind him. Naruto had attempted to hold a silent conversation with his teammates, and became frustrated when they didn't understand, or rather when Sakura hadn't understood and Sasuke had refused to respond. Over the decades, shinobi hand signs had evolved into a separate language that was practically every ninja's second language, as well as the universal shinobi language that was most frequently used on joint missions. Each village had its own language that had developed from their standard hand signs, and just about every clan had created its own dialect. When a civilian-born or raised shinobi learned the language both universal and local from their teammates, they usually picked up inflections and sign variations from the dominant clan on the team. The dominant clan on Naruto's team, which was more of a family actually, had been the Shimura, which made Naruto's distinct Uchiha accent all the more puzzling. Rather than attempting to chat without the sensei overhearing as most genin tried to do at some point during their careers, Naruto had been trying to relay a slightly complicated battle plan that had involved team positions to the rest of the team. As far as he was concerned, Naruto had been perfectly intelligible despite his use of several unconventional signs, including a few slightly vulgar ones which were almost exclusively used by one of Konoha's street gangs. Sakura had not understood him at all, however, and, after initially giving him a briefly puzzled look, Sasuke had refused to respond when Naruto had asked him a couple questions about his preferred range of combat in order to refine his plan. After failing to receive the response he'd expected, Naruto had snapped at the other two, which had led to an argument, which had somehow led to Naruto finally losing his last shred of patience with Sakura and loudly listing what were in his opinion every last one of Sakura's failings, which had led to a vicious row between the two of them that had eventually de-escalated to the usual bickering. Except that Sakura was now in the mix rather than silently hanging back and occasionally chiming in her support for Sasuke like she usually did. If this continued, he might have to let Sasuke and Sakura go. He may be the only person in the village who could teach Sasuke how to use his Sharingan if or when it finally manifested, but he didn't really have to be the boy's teacher full-time to do so. More than enough Jounin and Tokubetsu Jounin had made apprenticeship offers for the boy, so it wasn't like the Uchiha would go without being trained in everything else. Sasuke seemed to do better with one-on-one training anyway. He also knew a pretty good by-the-book Tokubetsu Jounin who might like to have Sakura, since he now had some free time on his hands because his student was attending the academy. The girl could be trained to be a private tutor or an academy instructor, since she seemed to know all of the books by heart, and seemed to take great pleasure in imparting that knowledge. As he walked in formation with his team, Sasuke watched Kakashi and that boy communicate. The argument they'd been engaged in earlier had turned to cold silence after that boy and Sakura finished snipping at each other after that boy criticized Sakura's textbook perfect performance in everything she did, and told her that she was quite likely going to get herself killed by a ninja who had bought the academy texts off the black market if she continued to religiously adhere to the academy curriculum rather than develop her own style. Now, Kakashi and that boy were holding a conversation completely in hand signs. While this normally wouldn't be of interest to him, he had noticed that the two of them were using a number of signs that had been exclusively used internally within his clan throughout the conversation. Where did you learn? He finally signed to the two when his curiosity had gotten the best of him. He could tell that he was seriously rusty, but then again, he hadn't been able to communicate this way with anyone in years. Kakashi replied with what was obviously a personal call sign, since the man couldn't possibly have learned the Uchiha signs from a piece of eyewear. He wasn't familiar with that call sign, however, but then again, he hadn't known the call signs of everyone in the clan. That boy signed back, older boy show once. Watch people's hands, watch police, so you know when to run. He'd learned the Uchiha signs just by watching? And now that he thought about it, what the hell had he been running from the police for? Why you not answer earlier? That boy signed, still upset at his prior lack of response. The reason he hadn't answered that boy earlier had been out of embarrassment, not that he'd ever tell him. He hadn't communicated this way for years, and hadn't been all that fluent, as he'd only been learning for about a year or so when he stopped. Naturally, he'd forgotten a number of the signs over the years since he'd had no one to talk to since he was 8, and hadn't needed anything more than the standard signs that were taught in the academy since then. As if just to show how much better he was, that boy had of course revealed that he was extremely fluent, and had an idiomatic grasp of the language. When he'd realized he'd only partially understood what that boy had been saying, and that he'd forgotten the sign for close to mid-range, he had decided to remain silent, rather than reveal his ignorance. He would of course continue to remain silent on that matter, as revealing his ignorance would only cause him even greater embarrassment now. Sakura watched Sasuke, Kakashi and Naruto communicate and felt a little jealous over the fact that she was being left out once more. When Naruto had tried to communicate with her earlier, it had taken her a full minute to even realize that that had been what he was doing. It had been the attack, defend, and location signs that she'd learned at the academy that had finally clued her in. Ino Pig had started to teach her some sort of language that involved the academy hand signs years ago, but she had quit when they had decided to become rivals. She still remembered some signs like flower and tree though, none of which Naruto had used. After a while, Sasuke stopped communicating, and nothing Naruto did would get him signing again. Eventually, Naruto gave up. After Naruto gave up on Sasuke, Kakashi started a private conversation with Naruto, and she understood absolutely none of it. After a long period of silent communication, Kakashi looked back at her and started signing something. Naruto looked upset and signed something back. Kakashi replied by repeating what he'd signed earlier. Looking rather put upon, Naruto turned and walked back to her, muttering under his breath the entire time. What signs do you know? Naruto snapped when he reached her. She went through all of the academy signs, starting with the 12 basic hand seals used in jutsu and continuing through the ones meant to alert someone to the presence of the enemy or convey the most basic elements for a plan of attack, namely, a set of numbers, a distance indicator, centimeters, meters, kilometers, the cardinal directions, over there, wait for time interval of X, hours, minutes, seconds at X time, hide, defend, retreat, and attack. Crap. Naruto moaned. I've really got my work cut out for me. Did Naruto mean what she thought he meant? Naruto looked around, but still seemed hesitant for some reason. Kakashi signed an affirmative, and he relaxed slightly. Okay, here are the basic kana, Naruto said as he began a series of 48 signs. Sasuke had been completely amazed by the sight of the incomplete bridge that would soon connect Wave to the mainland and therefore had had a hard time hiding his reaction to that amazement. He succeeded, however, if only just. A good shinobi never showed his emotions, and he was determined to be an even better shinobi than that man had been. Upon first catching sight of the bridge, Sakura had gasped in amazement and quietly complimented Tazuna. That boy, however, damn it! Why didn't I think of that earlier? That boy grumbled before digging in his pack and pulling out a shirt that was a shade of orange that was almost brown. Sasuke, take that shirt off. That boy said. Why? He asked. Other than the old saying, if you see a fan, go for the eyes? That boy replied. I don't want the enemy to know that there's another prize on the team, which will happen if you drop that pack of yours. You're still small enough to be portable, and almost of breeding age, which means you'll fetch a good price on the black market. Tetsuo-sensei nearly got himself killed last year recovering a girl from one of the lesser clans. And we don't need a problem like that on top of all the problems this mission already has. Seeing that his teammate's logic was sound in this instance, he quickly pulled his shirt off and accepted the orange one that boy had offered, even though it wasn't his favorite color. He'd heard the horror stories when he was little, and they'd given him nightmares. Back before the massacre, his elder cousins had delighted in telling him stories of Uchiha being blinded in battle, and of Uchiha children being stolen in the night. Despite the fact that he didn't have a clan to protect him and retrieve him should he be taken anymore, he had not even once considered the possibility of either happening to him while on this mission. That boy who had never had a clan or a bloodline, and had never faced the possibility of such things happening to him, and therefore should be mostly unaware of the risk obviously had however. As he carefully folded his shirt, making sure the Uchiha clan symbol was both on the outside and unfolded and put it in his pack, that boy held his hand out to Sakura expectantly. "What?" Sakura finally asked when that boy made an impatient gimme gesture. "Fan club pin," that boy said, as he made the Uchiha clan general call sign, obviously still trying to teach Sakura the language, though why he had made that sign instead of the sign for pin, he didn't know. The girl rather reluctantly pulled something out of one of the hidden pockets on her dress and handed it to that boy, looking very unhappy to be doing so. "Where the hell did you get this?" "This thing is a collector's item," that boy said as he turned the object over in his hands. "My grandmother's stuff. Mom let me have it after she died," the girl said in a mumble, looking slightly embarrassed. "What is it?" he asked. "One of the original Uchiha Izuna fan club pins from back before the founding. You can tell by the craftsmanship that indicates that it comes from the land of iron rather than Konoha and the odd marking on the back. The ones for the Madara fan club had a different marking, and the ones for your fan club are Konoha made, of a cheaper metal, and don't have a marking. I started collecting the damn things after I got a Madara pin from Tetsuo-sensei for my 11th birthday along with a copy of his trap book. I have no idea where he got it though because the people who kept them all these years generally aren't willing to part with them since they're practically family heirlooms at this point," that boy said as he handed it to him. "It'll be far less obvious than that giant fan on your back, but still allow you to hold to the tradition of wearing your clan standard into battle. Pin it to your collar." "How do you know about that tradition?" he asked as he complied, a little dubiously, considering the origins of the pin. "You are currently wearing the Uzumaki spiral," Naruto said as he pointed to a design that was of a blood-red shinobi spiral that looked to be set into a target of some sort that was on the right sleeve of the shirt he was wearing. "You do realize, Naruto, that by allowing Sasuke to wear your clan symbol, you've adopted him into your clan, don't you?" Kakashi called over lazily from the back of the boat. "I what?" that boy yelled. Momochi Zabuza resisted the urge to shift impatiently. After hours and hours of waiting, his target was very slowly in his opinion coming up the road with his escort. He counted 3 genin and a very familiar-looking silver-haired jounin. As he looked over the team that was approaching, he assessed his opponents. He would have to watch out for the pink-haired one, as unusual hair colors were almost always a sign of a kekei genkai of some sort. He might have to watch out for the blonde one as well, considering the facial markings that looked to have been tattooed onto his cheeks, since such tattoos on kids that age were a sign of them belonging to a ninja clan. The black-haired one was of least concern. As he was sizing up his opponents, the blonde-haired one started sniffing the air, and turned slightly in his direction. The boy hadn't been obvious about it, but he'd seen that method of tracking often enough to recognize it. He'd encountered members of a tattooed ninja clan in Konoha whose behavior matched that of the boy a number of times before, and had barely escaped with his life each time he'd done so. The boy was obviously an Inuzuka, though why he didn't have a dog with him, perhaps it was ill and had to be left at home. As he watched, the blonde Inuzuka's hand moved toward the kunai pouch that had been strapped to his leg. He'd been made. He quickly switched places with Haku's rabbit an instant before the kunai went sailing through the spot he'd previously occupied. The team went to investigate immediately afterward, and only found the distraction. "Naruto, why did you attack that poor defenseless rabbit?" the pink-haired girl asked, sounding horrified. "It smells like people," the unfortunately named Inuzuka replied. Knowing that he'd lost the advantage of surprise, he prepared to make his attack. Despite the natures of the man's students, his main opponent would be Sharingan Kakashi the copy ninja. In a battle such as the upcoming one, the genin would be little more than a distraction. Fortunately for him, the genin would be a distraction to the Hatake as well, a distraction he'd be forced to protect, tipping the balance in his favor. It was time for him to make his entrance. A properly dramatic entrance that was made when his opponents were expecting a stealthy attack from behind, usually threw his opponents off balance, tipping the battle more firmly in his favor. With that in mind, he decided that dramatic entrance number 6 was best for this situation. As soon as the opportunity presented itself, he sent his sword flying across the clearing that the Hatake and his genin team were standing in to bury itself in the trunk of a tree, and leapt onto the extended handle when it had, landing with his back facing the audience. Based on the reaction of the target and the genin, his entry had been flawlessly executed. Now for the show. Tazuna discreetly checked to make sure he hadn't wet himself. He hadn't. Good. He was glad that was over. It had been a very long time since he'd last had the misfortune of witnessing a ninja battle close up. He had forgotten the sheer terror and confusion that was involved as the impossible happened right in front of one's eyes with potentially deadly results. He hadn't really understood what had been going on, and therefore wouldn't be the best witness to ask if one wanted the story of what had happened during the battle between what were obviously 2 legendary ninja later. They'd been walking along the road when the Uzumaki who had been reminding him of his dead cousin the entire trip why had Konoha sent him, had suddenly attacked a rabbit out of the blue, saying that it smelled like people. Considering the fact that he'd been sniffing the air like a dog while they'd been in the boat, he shouldn't have been surprised, much less doubtful that his sense of smell was that acute, but he still had been. Then, suddenly, There was a flying sword which had nearly taken his head off before it buried itself halfway into a tree. The gray-haired guy moved to confront the guy who had jumped on the sword that was now in the tree after that, and the 3 kids had moved to protect him. The enemy ninja, who was wearing gray button fly pants and cow print arm and leg warmers and had his face covered in bandages, jumped onto the water and made a bunch of mist after the gray-haired man had pulled up his headband and revealed that he actually had 2 eyes, though the other one didn't match. Then, things got really weird, scary, and dangerous. Weapons went flying everywhere as the 2 men repeatedly turned into water, and then the Uzumaki suddenly multiplied and started setting traps everywhere. The black-haired boy joined the fray at this point and got injured somehow. At some other point during the battle, he found himself in the bushes while a copy of himself blew up in the enemy ninja's face. Then, the 2 men who'd started the fight got into some sort of jutsu contest and started making water dragons that tried to eat each other or something, and sent water flying everywhere. The battle eventually ended when a hunter nin from Kiri showed up, killed the demon guy who'd apparently gone on a homicidal rampage when he was a kid and killed the entire student body of a school, and left with the body. Afterward, the gray-haired guy collapsed, and the Uzumaki somehow made 2 of his clones turn into stretchers on which he placed the gray-haired guy and the black-haired boy. "You're going to get yourself killed one day if you keep leaping into danger without any forward planning, Sasuke," the Uzumaki said as 2 of his clones carried the stretcher towards the road. "Sometimes doing so is a good thing, since if you don't have any plans, nobody can anticipate them, but most of the time it isn't. You're damn lucky that Zabuza guy had just been messing around with you. You would have been dead otherwise." And with that, the battle was completely over, and they made their way to his home and the possibility of a home-cooked if somewhat meager meal, and some medical attention for the injured members of their party. Fortunately, Tsunami had picked up some top-notch first aid skills thanks to some of the more daring antics of her first husband, who had been an adrenaline junkie who had gotten himself killed in a water-skiing accident. He'd honestly expected the man to die during one of his base jumps, and had made several bets to that effect which he had lost. He hadn't been very fond of the man, but Tsunami, who had been young and head over heels in love with him, had refused to listen to his advice, and married him anyways. When the man had finally died, he'd left her alone with a newborn Inari and a mountain of debt that had forced her to move back in with him. Kaiza had been a much better son-in-law, husband, and father, even if he couldn't afford his own home and constantly mooched off of him. Sakura was torn between worry for her sensei and worry for Sasuke. Neither of the 2 had come away from the battle with the missing nin unscathed. Kakashi sensei was suffering from a very severe bout of chakra exhaustion, and Sasuke had a broken arm and a concussion. As he watched him sleep, Naruto had confided in her that there was a possibility that Kakashi-sensei wouldn't make it through the night. If it hadn't been for Naruto's quick thinking, there was a good chance that Sasuke would be dead right now instead of merely wounded. Despite the fact that Naruto hated Sasuke and normally didn't want anything to do with him, he had risked his life to save him. When she had asked Naruto why, he'd said those who break the rules are trash. Those who abandon their teammates are worse than trash. Sasuke is my teammate, and no matter what I feel about him, I won't leave him behind. She didn't know what to think of that. Naruto hated them, and didn't want to work with them, but would risk his life to save them in a heartbeat. Would she be willing to risk her life to save someone she hated? Would she stand up to a much stronger enemy, and use herself as a distraction knowing that there was a good chance she'd die so Ino, for instance, could get away? When she was little, she'd wanted to be a ninja like those guys in the animal masks she'd sometimes seen around the village. She had joined the academy where her motive changed from becoming one of the animal mask people to impressing Ino, who had protected her from a group of bullies, and then later changed to impressing Sasuke. When she graduated, neither of them were impressed. Was this what being a ninja was? Possibly sacrificing yourself for someone you hate so the mission could be completed? Inside the village, she'd been cool, she'd been awesome, she'd been on the fast track to becoming the future Mrs. Uchiha. People had looked up to her. Outside the village, however, she'd been a minor annoyance to the enemy, a bug to be swatted, a bug that would have been swatted if her sensei and her teammates hadn't been there. Seeing that it was possible, she realized that she didn't want to be crushed or swatted. Right now, however, considering the fact that she couldn't even come close to measuring up to Sasuke, who was the second weakest member of the team, there was a distinct possibility of that happening. Naruto felt slightly worried as he watched Kakashi sleep. While there was a very good chance he'd wake up, there was also a slight possibility that instead of evening out, his breathing would slow and eventually stop. Severe cases of chakra exhaustion like the one Kakashi had were weird like that. While he was currently very, very upset with the man, Kakashi was still on his list of precious people if only just, and he didn't want him to die. Sasuke had already been seen to. Tazuna's daughter Tsunami, who was a very capable woman who apparently knew the correct way to set and splint broken arms, and deal with a concussion, had seen to that earlier. Unlike Kakashi, he had little fear that Sasuke's condition would get worse, unless the Uchiha ran off and did something stupid. All that was left for the team to do now was to rest, guard the house in case Gato had hired someone else, and wait for Kakashi to wake up. Much to the relief of Naruto, who had spent the night keeping vigil at his bedside, Kakashi awoke the next morning. No matter what he felt about them at any given time, the people of Konoha were his responsibility to protect. The ninja of Konoha that he served alongside were his responsibility to bring home, and the people who truly cared about him were his precious people whom he'd do just about anything for. Having any one of them die on his watch while there was something he could have possibly done to prevent it was unacceptable. He had been very angry with Kakashi for the last several months. The man knew him, knew that he already had a sensei, and yet he still took him despite this. After apologizing for the irresponsible manner in which he had taught him Kage Bunshin 2 years ago, Kakashi had checked up on him occasionally between missions, and he would say hi to the man every time he saw him around the village, which was most often near the memorial stone which he visited to pay his respects to his mother, and the yondaime before heading over to Yamaguchi and Fujiwara's graves to say hi. When Kakashi almost died the night before because he had overexerted himself during the battle with that missing nin from Kiri, he had been feeling scared and regretful over the fact that they would have parted under such bad terms. Kakashi was one of his precious people, and he was one of the few people who hadn't given him that cold look the first time he met him. His being completely pissed off at the man didn't change that fact. Fortunately, Kakashi had pulled through, and his breathing had stopped being shaky and evened out to a more regular pattern that indicated he was asleep sometime around midnight. He still kept watch afterward just in case, and there had been no other signs of trouble since then, and Kakashi was showing signs of waking up. As Kakashi was opening his uncovered eye, he went to fetch Sasuke and Sakura, who would undoubtedly be happy to see that their sensei had actually woken up, even if Sasuke was currently feeling rather miserable despite the painkillers he'd given him earlier. The danger had passed. Kakashi was aware and moving around, which meant that he would live, though it would take him several days to recover. Soon, the three of them were seated at the man's bedside. As team leader, Kakashi would be the one to give them orders. Shit. Kakashi groaned once he was fully aware of his surroundings. An ominous feeling came over him. That wasn't the I did something exceedingly dangerous, and now I'm paying for it, swear. That was the crap. There's a distinct possibility that I royally screwed up. Swear. Not a good sign. Not a good sign at all. What? He asked, almost dreading the answer because, if Kakashi was so concerned over screwing up, something that was so beyond serious that it wasn't even funny had most likely gone wrong. That hunter nin took the body. Kakashi replied. He didn't know what the significance of this obviously significant statement was, and he didn't like not knowing. Not knowing meant that you were left out of the loop, which was a dangerous place to be if you were a ninja. As soon as he got back to Konoha, he would have to force himself to sit still long enough to read up on hunter ninja and their practices. Making sure he could read properly and know how to research any subject he needed to had been one of the best things Tetsuo-sensei had ever done for him. Hunter nin are supposed to dispose of the corpse right there, so foreign ninja can't intercept them and take the body from them in order to learn its secrets. Kakashi continued. Yeah, he was feeling like swearing too. They had let some 2-bit missing nin pull a con on them, and now they were in serious trouble because of it. That Zabuza guy was going to be coming back, and he'd be pissed as hell when he did. Ninja generally didn't like to lose, and especially didn't like being humiliated in front of a bunch of genin, or worse, in front of civilians. Zabuza had done both. Based on the technique the fake hunter nin used, and the damage Zabuza took, it will be several days before he is up and about. We've only got about a week to prepare for his next attack. Kakashi continued, summarizing his estimate of the situation. A week. Perfect. Now this was his favorite kind of fight. He would have to be careful with any of the traps he made though, as he didn't want the locals stumbling into them and getting themselves hurt. Perhaps something that would be set to only go off at the command of the setter then. Inari sat in his room staring at the picture of his father Kaiza. Unlike most times, he wasn't crying, he was thinking. Last night, shortly after grandfather had returned with the strangers, he had confronted them. Gato's too strong. If you stand up to him, you're all going to die. He yelled at the kids who were only a few years older than him, and were about to throw their lives away for nothing. If I die, then I die, but at least I go knowing I did my best to help. The blonde boy who was helping his mother fix up the dark-haired boy said, Do you think you're a hero or something? There's no such thing as heroes. He'd yelled at the boy. There weren't any heroes. Heroes only lived in fairy tales, and the idiots who thought they were heroes always got themselves killed, leaving those they left behind to try to pick up the pieces. The blonde boy had looked at him and shook his head sadly. There are heroes, the blonde boy said. In real life, however, the hero doesn't always save everyone, and sometimes the hero's only reward for his actions is to go to the afterlife knowing that he had done his best, and hoping that someone will take up his banner and succeed where he had failed. I myself would rather die trying to save everyone than watch the people around me suffer without doing anything. Had his father really been a hero rather than a fool? Had his father gone to the afterlife with the same hope? Had he let the man who had vowed to raise him despite the fact that they weren't blood down? Grandpa had picked his father's banner up when it fell when he continued construction on the bridge despite all of the threats that had been made against him, and was going to pay the ultimate price because of it. Was it worth it though? Last night he would have said that it most definitely was not, and that the way of the world was that the strong crushed the weak, and that Gato was the strong, and that anyone who went against him pointlessly wasted their lives. Now though, there was a small niggling doubt, a doubt that had been caused by the last thing the blonde boy had said as he was leaving the room. As he turned to run back to his room, the blonde boy had said evil only flourishes when good men do nothing. He had been doing nothing for a long time, and had been urging others to do nothing as well. Had he been making Gato strong because of this? Gato hadn't seemed so strong until after Dad had died and everyone was afraid to do anything about it. Sakura sat there thinking as she tended to Kakashi after Naruto had told her to make herself useful. Unlike most of the time when she had all the free time she wanted to fantasize about becoming Mrs. Uchiha, she had a great deal to think about. Last night, Naruto, who had gotten fed up with her once more, had asked her why she had even wanted to be a ninja in the first place, and she had answered him honestly, though she didn't know why. Instead of laughing at her naive childishness, he'd whistled and said, "A&BU? That's one tough goal, you'll probably make it though. You won't catch the Hokage's attention if you keep hanging back and expecting Sasuke to rescue you." However, at this point, she wasn't sure she even wanted to become an A&BU, much less if she still wanted to be a ninja. As she was now, she was weak and could easily be killed if there was no one to jump in and do her fighting for her. But Naruto had honestly seemed to believe that she could become one of the village's most elite ninja who were hand-selected by the Hokage to serve him someday if she worked hard at it. He'd even gone so far as to lay out a plan for her to be able to reach her goal. Strange, it wasn't until then that she'd realized that she didn't have any goals in life other than to become Mrs. Uchiha. What came after she attained that goal? Babies? And what else? What would she do to fill her time when Sasuke was out on missions? What would she do if Sasuke died on one? What would there be after Sasuke? Becoming an A&BU and life after Sasuke weren't the only things she had to think about though. She hadn't known if it was stupidity or courage that had made her do so, but she had asked Naruto why he had killed those two genin from IWA. He told her it hadn't been because they had blocked his promotion, as she'd spent the last several months believing. If she'd seen two of her classmates, or even any two ninjas she'd met, say, the week before be killed in front of her, would she do what Naruto had done? Would she lose it so completely that she wouldn't even realize that the people responsible for killing her comrades were dead until long after their broken and bleeding bodies had fallen to the ground? She had heard so many times that the life of a ninja was one that was filled with pain and death while she was in the academy, but she truly hadn't begun to realize what that had meant until now. It was too late to turn back, however. She'd signed a 5-year service agreement when she had earned her spot on the team, instead of the 1-year provisional agreement that had been recommended. The only way she could get out now is if they kicked her out, and ninja who got kicked out were held in contempt in Konoha. If she were dismissed, she would have to move and leave everything she knew behind if she didn't want to live as an outcast. Sasuke too was thinking despite the headache from the concussion, but it wasn't about his goals and ambitions. He'd asked Kakashi where he'd gotten his Sharingan eye, and the man had refused to answer. An expression that looked like a cross between guilt and grief crossed what little he could see of the man's face before he turned his back to him and dismissed him. Certain that he would know, considering the fact that he seemed to know any number of things he shouldn't, he'd then gone to that boy for the answers Kakashi had refused to give him. That boy had indeed known as he'd suspected he would. "I heard what everyone knows from Tetsuo-sensei," that boy said. Back during the war, Kakashi was on a team with an Uchiha named Obito. Something went seriously wrong during a mission, and Kakashi came back with the eye, a missing teammate, even more issues than he'd left with, and a new habit that had caused Obito Time to be renamed Kakashi Time. Since the clan had been alive at the time and would have demanded the man's head on a plate if that had been what happened, he knew that Kakashi hadn't stolen his teammate's eye. The answer to how he'd gotten it then was that Obito had given it to him. Why would Obito have done something like that? Why would he give one of his eyes, knowing that he risked never finding the right path on his journey through the afterlife? Kakashi had not even been blood, he'd just been a teammate. Kakashi struggled to sit up. It was a difficult task, however. He was tired and his muscles refused to cooperate. He needed to get up quickly though. He needed to start training his students for the coming confrontation as soon as possible, which would be just as soon as he could stand with or without assistance. He knew what he needed to start them on since he wouldn't be able to use his chakra or move around all that much for a while, and frankly he should have started it weeks ago considering the benefits the exercise held for the uninitiated, instead of wasting his time on completely pointless teamwork exercises. Naruto pretty much had this skill mastered already, so he would have to find something else for the boy to do. He did have a bit of spare testing paper on him that he'd won in a bet. Maybe he would start training the boy to harness his chakra affinity so he could more easily master elemental jutsu. He knew that the boy already had a couple wind jutsu in his arsenal, and they could become even more powerful where he trained. With that plan in mind, he lay back down. While it was a good thing to exert oneself, overdoing it was detrimental to one's well-being. As he lay there, he speculated on what Minato-sensei's son's elemental affinity would be. Would it be wine like his father, as the boy's small arsenal of elemental jutsu indicated, or would it be water like his mother? The boy looked like both parents and took after both parents, though he favored his mother in looks and behavior somewhat as that odd verbal tic indicated so. It would be interesting to find out which one he favored in that area. Unfortunately, even if Naruto possessed the ability, He had absolutely no idea as to how one would go about teaching the boy how to create the chakra chains that his mother had been able to create, which was a pity since Naruto could have used them to hold their opponent down while he beat him up. Naruto stared down at the piece of paper that Kakashi had given him dubiously. Kakashi had decided to test his elemental affinity out of the blue that morning. While a ninja could learn elemental jutsu that were outside of their affinity, even without knowing one's affinity, elemental jutsu that were of one's affinity were usually much easier to learn and that much more potent. Truly mastering one's affinity, especially to the point where one could manipulate chakra to transform it into that elemental nature, and possibly even create new jutsu, took years. Usually, a ninja started mastering their affinity when they made Chunin. Tetsuo-sensei had promised to test him the minute he got his vest, and help him master his affinity as soon as he knew what it was. Naruto's problem wasn't with any of that, as he'd been dying with curiosity to learn what his affinity was, and didn't think Tetsuo-sensei would mind too much if he took an early peek. The problem he had at the moment was with the chakra test paper itself. "And tell me again what happens if my affinity is fire?" he asked, hoping that he misheard Kakashi when the man had been explaining the different reactions that the special paper had to different chakra types. "The paper will burn," Kakashi replied. Yeah, that's what he thought he heard. The paper would burn, and it would be in his hand when that happened too. Considering the fact that the predominant affinity in Konoha was fire, and the fact that he didn't know who his father was aside from the fact that he'd been a resident of Konoha. "Don't worry, it's perfectly safe," Kakashi said, trying to reassure him. It wasn't all that reassuring though. "How many of these things do you have on you?" he asked. "A few." "Why?" Kakashi replied. "Here's Sasuke," he said as he handed his paper to the boy who had been looking at it with a jealous gleam in his eye. He'd seen the boy using fire jutsu with relative ease, and, while that could be the result of early training by a fire-aligned family, it was more likely the result of an untested fire affinity. The instant he made his offer, the boy snatched the test paper from him almost greedily, and started to channel chakra into it as Kakashi had instructed him to do. Crinkle. Whoosh. Ow. Sanuva. Stomp. 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 That pretty much had been what he had thought would happen. The double affinity was interesting though. Maybe it was an extra Kekkai Genkai, considering the fact that there were Kekkai Genkai that allowed people to mix two different elements to create a new advanced element. Double Kekkai Genkai had shown up in some families on occasion though. Usually when you tried to mix two Kekkai Genkai, all you got was a mess. At least, that's what he'd heard happened. He wondered what fire and lightning would make, other than a more effective way of destroying things, that is. As soon as the first paper was finally disposed of by the Uchiha, Kakashi offered him a second piece of the test paper to replace the one he'd given to Sasuke. He didn't want to take it though. Watching someone else get burned by one of the things had been enough to make him definitely not want to risk it, rather than be somewhat cautious about doing so. "Look, Naruto, it's perfectly safe," Kakashi said, sounding slightly frustrated. "Your mother's affinity was water, and therefore there is virtually no chance of you being a fire affinity since water is a dominant trait that drowns out fire roughly 999 times out of a 1000 in such pairings, and there is a very good chance that your father wasn't a fire affinity anyways. Why the hell hadn't he said so in the first place? If he just explained that earlier, Sasuke wouldn't have had to go through the trauma of having his fingers burned just now, and he wouldn't have had to go through the trauma of watching it happen. Well, at least Sasuke had gotten something out of the experience. Sighing, he took the paper and channeled chakra into it. It cut itself in two. Wind. Figured, since the few wind jutsu he'd learned had come to him much more easily than the fire jutsu he dubbed the arsonist's best friend that he picked up, and that one was a rather small flame that wasn't nearly as noticeable as the flashier and higher-ranking fire jutsu that some ninja had a habit of flinging about. Well, now that that's out of the way, I may as well start Sasuke and Sakura on their training before I show you the first exercise of your elemental training," Kakashi said. Sasuke and Sakura perked up at this slightly, as Kakashi turned his focus on them. "Today you will be learning to climb trees," Kakashi said cheerfully. The instant Kakashi made that announcement, he found himself pitying Sasuke. That had been incredibly mean of the man. Most ninja tended to gather their chakra by using either the ram's seal, or a one-handed variant of it. Sasuke's left arm was broken and in an improvised cast, making the ram's seal and just about every other seal for that matter impossible, and he had several burned fingers on the arm that wasn't broken, which would make forming the half-ram painfully difficult. Not only that, but he was suffering from the after-effects of a concussion as well. Kakashi was clearly enjoying the dumbfounded looks his two students were giving him over the fact that they were finally going to learn the tree climbing exercise. Well, as far as he was concerned, it was about damn time. They said that each sensei had their own teaching style, but waiting 5 months before teaching one of the most basic chakra control exercises bordered on criminal. He himself had started learning it during his first few days under Tetsuo-sensei. "You'll be doing it without your hands," Kakashi said cheerfully in reply to Sakura's whine of "but I already know how to climb trees." Kakashi was definitely enjoying this like the sadistic bastard he was reputed to be. Poor Sasuke, Naruto here will demonstrate," Kakashi said, putting him on the spot. "Great." Heaving a put-upon sigh, he walked up to the nearest tree and started walking up the trunk, which was bare of branches for about the first 30 feet or so in a spiral pattern. He then selected a branch that was in full view of the others and walked along its underside, stopping about midway. Both Sasuke and Sakura gaped up at him. Sasuke looked jealous of his rather pedestrian ability. Then again, Sasuke always looked either upset or jealous when he did something the other boy hadn't learned yet. To do this, you must concentrate your chakra onto the soles of your feet. Kakashi explained to his students. Too much, and you crack the bark of the tree and fly off. Too little, and you won't stick. Use these to mark your progress. Kakashi said as he threw a pair of kunai into the ground in front of Sakura and Sasuke. Sasuke naturally had a great deal of difficulty with the exercise, which was completely understandable considering the condition he was in. Sakura managed it perfectly the first time. Apparently the girl had near-perfect to perfect chakra control. The medical corps would be drooling over her if they found out. The medical corps had suffered a severe drop in enlistment over the last few years because genjutsu had become a fashionable specialty amongst kunoichi who were much more likely to have the perfect chakra control necessary for medical jutsu than their male counterparts. He knew this because medical corps had been after Suzume ever since she'd made Chunin. You'd better hide Sakura when we get back to Konoha Kakashi, or the medical corps will try to steal her, he said half-jokingly after Sakura had made her way up the tree. Considering how desperate they were for qualified new recruits, he wouldn't be surprised if that actually happened. Sakura stared at Naruto from the high branch she was perched in. With an offhand remark, the boy had handed her an out she could take without disgracing herself or her family should she choose to do so. If she trained as a medic, she could work in the hospital, as in off the field and away from battle. Medics were highly prized, and retired medics could go into practice as medical doctors after a certain number of years of service as a medic should they choose to do so. If she became a medic, she would have the career she needed and the training she needed when she left the ninja life forever. Becoming a medic had another potential positive as well. If she decided that she didn't want to completely waste several years of effort she had put into becoming a kunoichi so far, and wanted to achieve the goal that had gotten her to attend the academy in the first place, instead of deciding to leave once her 5 years or however long it took to get her certification as a doctor were up, however, medics would be valued amongst the ANBU as well. Someone would have to make sure the prisoner survived until it was brought in, or patch the team up if things went south. It may as well be her if it was anybody. Either way, training as a medic would be useful for her future whichever path she decided to take. That, and it would be useful when she was married to Sasuke, as she had learned that children sometimes got themselves into the serious sort of trouble where seconds could mean the difference between life and death. Statistics for this were especially high in ninja villages where one had the risk of accidentally stabbing oneself with a poisoned weapon or setting off an explosive tag accidentally added on top of the usual risks. Should she choose to become a medic on the path towards leaving the ninja life rather than on the path towards staying, however, there was a slight hitch to this plan. Either her sensei would have to sign her up for the program if he felt her capable, or she would have to become a chunin in order to sign herself up if her sensei refused for whatever reason. Since there currently wasn't a surplus of genin, and the spring cycle class was evenly divisible by 3 as well, there was a good chance that Kakashi-sensei wouldn't split the team up before they took the Chunin exams, as Naruto had informed her that they needed a whole team to compete. Either way, the odds that she would have to take the Chunin exams were high, and if she did, she would have to do her damned hardest to pass, in case Kakashi-sensei refused to sign the forms releasing her from his team. Either path she chose, her life would not start until after the team entered the Chunin exams. Until then, she would have to learn all she could of the shinobi arts in order to pass the exams when the time came. Hopefully, she would be strong enough that she wouldn't be squashed as an afterthought by then. Sasuke growled as he tried once more to make his way up the tree. Once again, he didn't make it past a few feet, and most of the distance he'd attained had been more from the momentum he'd built up on the way to the tree. Sakura, who had never done this before, had been able to manage to make her way to the top of her tree perfectly the first time. Kakashi said it was because she had so little chakra that she was able to control it easily, but he wasn't too sure. He would do this, however. He would master this to the point that he was better than that boy who had climbed his tree with the greatest of ease and hung upside down until Kakashi called him over for some special advanced training. As he struggled to climb the tree, he tried to figure out whether that boy had been playing with him or with Kakashi when he'd handed him that test paper. While it had made for a rather vicious prank as he'd gotten his fingers burned, he now knew his elemental affinity, or affinities rather. It was quite possible that he would not have learned them until much later if that boy who had already been certain of at least one of his affinities hadn't handed him that paper. What was that boy up to? Had that boy been trying to do him a favor, or was this the start of some twisted new game? Relaxed Sasuke. That boy called over to him from near where he stood with Kakashi. It's a whole lot easier when you're not frustrated. You should stop a while, use one of the meditation techniques they taught at the academy, and try again. Stop and meditate? What the hell was that boy playing at? You should use Kage Bunshin on this exercise to get the most out of it, Kakashi said after he'd finished explaining the leaf-cutting exercise and its purpose to his student. But Tetsuo-sensei told me not to, Naruto replied. This reply naturally added to his frustration. Ever since Naruto had become his student, it had been Tetsuo-sensei this, and Tetsuo-sensei that. But Tetsuo-sensei said seemed to be the boy's favorite phrase. Not once had he heard a Kakashi-sensei from the boy. He'd heard 100 yes sirs, but no yes Kakashi-sensei. He understood that Naruto was upset at being taken from his former sensei, but he would still like at least a little acknowledgement for his role in the boy's life. Why did Shimura tell you not to? He asked, wondering why the man would handicap Naruto's potential progress in such a manner. Using Kage Bunshin would allow the boy to learn things much faster, especially with the sheer number of shadow clones that the boy could create. What would normally take the boy years to learn could be whittled down to mere weeks or even days depending on the number of Kage Bunshin that were used. Naruto looked embarrassed and slightly guilty for some reason, as if his not being allowed to use Kage Bunshin for training had been his own failing and not his previous teachers. I made them study while I ran off to play once, and Tetsuo-sensei caught me. Naruto replied, as long as you are working alongside the Kage Bunshin, it should be fine. He said, resolving to have words with Shimura for hampering his student's progress due to a youthful error. Naruto gave him a look, but reluctantly complied. Reluctant compliance had been all he'd gotten out of the boy since day one. It was rather disheartening. He wouldn't quit trying, however. He'd get through to the boy eventually. He made a vow to teach Minato-sensei's son, as Minato-sensei had taught him, and by all of the gods in existence, he would do it, despite the fact that someone had seemed to have gotten there first. While Zabuza was not yet well enough to be up and about, he was well enough that he could be left alone for a few hours without worry, and Haku needed to restock his supply of medicinal herbs. It had been a few days since the fight with the copy ninja and his genin, and the paralysis and chakra exhaustion had nearly worn off. Zabuza would need some more bed rest though before he was fully recovered, but, in his current condition, he would easily be able to defend himself from any of Gado's 2-bit thugs, should they decide to bother him. After checking on his master, Haku dressed himself in his favorite outfit and prepared to head out. He knew about the comments that were made about the fact that he often dressed like a girl even when he did not need to disguise himself as such, and didn't particularly care. He knew he was a boy no matter how he looked or what he wore, and if he wanted to dress like a girl, that was his prerogative. Besides, this outfit was made from a more comfortable material than the ones he usually wore when there was the possibility of going into battle, and while pink wasn't his favorite color, he wasn't averse to wearing it. When he made his way to a clearing that he noted contained the plants he would need when he'd passed through it earlier, he found a boy lying on the ground asleep, looking as if he had collapsed from exhaustion where he stood, too tired to seek shelter. His first instinct when he'd come across the boy who had been dressed in a dark orange shirt that was decorated with the red spiral he'd seen on the Konoha shinobi uniforms on one of the sleeves, and one of the spiral and a target symbols that he'd seen scattered throughout Yuzushigakure's ruins on the other had been to do whatever it took to protect Zabuza-sama. In this case, protecting Zabuza-sama would be to not allow the boy to get away and alert his companions to Zabuza-sama's likely survival if they weren't aware of the possibility already. Instead of killing the boy like he should have done, however, he yet again proved that he was too soft to truly be a shinobi, and shook him awake. You shouldn't be sleeping out here, especially in your weakened condition. You could catch your death of cold. It's still March, you know, and a cold snap could come on suddenly, he said to the boy who had startled awake and scurried backward when he had realized who was shaking him. I don't care, the boy said. I have to train. I have to become stronger than him. I believe that you become truly strong when you have someone precious to protect, he said to the boy. He knew this to be the truth because he was at his strongest when he was protecting Zabuza-sama. While training was well and good, and training oneself into the ground on occasion built character, there was a point where it was too much, and it looked like the boy had taken it that far. He'd done so himself enough times to know that training to the point of collapse too often was counterproductive and left him weak at times when he needed to be strong enough to protect Zabuza-sama. The boy gave him a strange look that seemed to be disbelief coupled with something he couldn't quite identify in response to his statement. Do you have someone precious to you? Someone you'd do anything to protect? He asked the boy. Not anymore, the boy said. They're all gone. That man killed them. That threw him slightly. He'd been living with the impression that people in Konoha had lived easy lives where the worst one of their extremely coddled children had to face was an orphanage where they'd be fed for a long while. The boy in front of him though was like he had been before Zabuza-sama had found him and given him purpose, unhappy and completely alone. I lost my precious people once, he said quietly, remembering the day when his father had killed his mother, and he had killed his father, and a number of the people in the small village he used to live in self-defense. Someone found me, and gave me a reason to live. Someday, you'll find someone else, and you'll be happy again when you do. The boy gave him a dubious look, as if he didn't believe him and didn't want to believe him. It was true, however. While he was still sad over the loss of his family and would always mourn the loss of his parents, he was happy he had Zabuza-sama. Zabuza needed him, and for as long as Zabuza-sama needed him, he would remain by his side serving him in every way he needed him to throughout good times and bad. Let me look at that arm of yours, he said, holding out his hand for the boy's broken arm which had been put in a temporary cast, deciding to change the subject to something a bit less deeply personal. While there was little to nothing he could do about the fact that all of the Konoha boy's precious people were gone, there was possibly something he could do about the boy's arm. Aside from knowing a great deal of herb lore, he had a few medical ninjutsu in his repertoire, and one of them was one that sped up the healing of broken bones considerably. The boy who was giving him a highly suspicious glare didn't look like he would cooperate with his request though. "I'm a fully trained medic," he said. That last statement had been slightly fudged, but he knew how to deal with broken bones, and had been forced to do so a couple days ago when he was tending to Zabuza after his battle with the copy ninja. He knew that he was taking a serious risk in doing this, but he couldn't just leave an injured person without trying to help, even if they were on the opposite side of a conflict he was involved in. The boy reluctantly complied, continuing to look at him suspiciously as if he expected him to stab him at any second. The boy clearly knew that he was in no shape to win any fight that would break out between them, however, and had therefore refrained from attacking. He took the offered arm and gently examined it. It had been a clean break, and the bone had been properly set. Under such favorable conditions, there was very easily something he could do for the boy, and after using one of the few medical jutsu he knew, the bone was healed. "You should get back," he said when he was finished. "Your sensei is undoubtedly worried about you." With a grunted thanks, the dark-haired boy left. He had no illusions that the boy wouldn't report him to his teacher. He would have to swiftly vacate the area and pick a different spot in which to gather the herbs he needed as quickly as he could so he could get back to Zabuza-sama as soon as possible. Aside from this and a nearby clearing, there was another clearing near the Yuzushiogakyu ruins that held the plants he was after as well. The clearing near the ruins seemed to be the safer choice, especially should the boy's teacher go looking for him rather than wait for him and Zabuza to come to them as they would be later on. After vacating the clearing which the Konoha genin had just departed, he made his way to the ruins to gather the herbs he needed. After he was done, he paused at the ruins as he customarily did while on his way back to Zabuza-sama, despite the fact that tarrying in such a manner was inadvisable. It was there that he saw the blonde boy he met in Kiri and had seen again on the road escorting Zabuza-sama's target. He immediately recognized him because the boy was rather unforgettable with that wild blonde hair, and those whisker marks that looked to have been tattooed onto his cheeks. The boy was carrying a bouquet of wildflowers as he wandered through the ruins for some strange reason. As the boy moved through the ruins, he seemed to be searching for something rather than wandering aimlessly. He hoped that whatever the boy was searching for, it wasn't him, because he wasn't in the mood to fight, and didn't want to be forced to kill the other ninja whom he was certain would recognize him for what he was, if he didn't recognize him for who he was. Some ninja had long memories, and some didn't. Eventually, the boy made his way into the overgrown graveyard that was choked with weeds, and after searching around for a while, he stopped in the section that contained a number of graves belonging to a clan called Uzumaki. "My name is Uzumaki Naruto," the boy who had offered to treat him to dinner said loudly with a bright smile on his face as he fiddled with a pair of chopsticks, impatiently waiting for the old man to finish preparing his ramen. "I'm going to be the Hokage someday." As he watched from the shadows, the blonde boy summoned a number of Kage Bunshin and, after setting the bouquet down on a random headstone, he joined them in cleaning up the cemetery. He was almost tempted to join the boy in his task, but he refrained from doing so. If the Uzumaki child who he couldn't forget was a Konoha ninja didn't recognize him as the girl he'd met in Kiri, he would surely recognize the fact that he was a ninja, and they would be forced to fight. He didn't want to fight the blonde boy since the boy was in obvious good health, was an unknown quantity skill-wise considering how many Kage Bunshin he was capable of producing with minimal effort, and would be fully willing to attack him in order to protect his client, as the outcome of the battle could potentially be in his favor. He had gotten lucky with the dark-haired boy who had been suffering from a mild case of chakra exhaustion on top of his other injuries earlier, and he knew it. He didn't believe that his luck would hold twice in one day. "I don't know which of you guys are my grandparents, but I'll bring flowers for all of you later," the Uzumaki boy said as he picked the bouquet of flowers back up when he and his clones had finished clearing all of the weeds out of the cemetery. The boy then carried the flowers to the Killed in Action monument that was located near the center of the cemetery, and laid them down before saying a brief prayer for the dead. Every shinobi village had such a monument, though they were never quite the same as, or in the same location as the memorials any other given village. Yuzushiogakyo's was a slab of black granite which had been polished at one time, which had the symbol of the village and the names of the dead etched into it. Time had taken the shine off of it and begun to wear the names away, but they were still legible, and a large number of them had been Uzumaki. As he watched the boy pay his respects to his fallen relatives, he felt slightly guilty, as if he were spying on something private. It was then that he realized that he had been trespassing in the home of this boy's ancestors for years without once properly paying his respects to the dead. While the Uzumaki's attention was turned elsewhere, he quietly left the cemetery, hoping the boy wouldn't notice that someone had intruded on his solitude. Naruto got up from where he had been kneeling in front of the Yuzushio monument. He had had the feeling that he was being watched the entire time he'd been in the ruins of the former ninja village, but now it was gone. Whether that was because his ancestors had been appeased by his attempts to pay his respects or because someone had actually been watching him and only just left, he didn't know. He had asked Tazuna-san for directions to the village earlier this morning, and the old man had rather reluctantly given them to him. It seemed that people avoided this place, believing it to be haunted. He too had a fear of ghosts, and had been slightly nervous when he had felt someone watching him from the shadows and had been unable to see him or her. If it had been a spirit, they apparently weren't offended by his presence. To get here today, He had taken one of the sorts of breaks from training that would have had Tetsuo-sensei rip him a new one if he'd caught him doing it. He had left his Kage Bunshin to do all of the work while he went and did something else. Tetsuo-sensei had told him that leaving his Kage Bunshin behind to do all the work was an exceedingly stupid and lazy thing to do when he had caught him doing it, as he would get in the habit of foisting all of his tasks off on his clones and never really learn to do anything for himself because his clones would then become lazier as a result of him becoming lazier, starting a vicious cycle. But today, there had been some extenuating circumstances. He had wanted to pay his respects to the ancestors he had never known in case he didn't get a chance to do so later, and hadn't wanted to stop his training either. After setting his clones to the leaf-cutting task that they seemed to be close to accomplishing, he had set out to gather flowers as an offering as there had not been any to be bought in the small town near Tazuna's house. Once he had the flowers, he came here. The ruins of Yuzushiobukyu were a desolate and lonely place, and some of the buildings looked as if they had been scavenged for building materials. Considering the current economic situation and the price of such materials, he understood why the locals had done so and didn't begrudge them what they took, since it would be better for them to be of use to the living than to crumble to dust and be completely forgotten. At least, the people who had gone scavenging for building materials had had the decency to leave the graveyard and the monument alone. The only issue he had with that was that it had been left entirely alone, and it looked as if nobody had come to tend to any of the graves in years if not decades. Deciding that it was the least he could do, he summoned another batch of Kage Bunshin and weeded the place while the one he'd assigned as a scout went to look for the village's Kia memorial. He knew that every village had one, because he'd asked Tetsuo-sensei about it when he'd spotted Kiris before the start of the rather ill-fated Chunin exams. Eventually, the cemetery was cleared, the monument was found, he'd been able to pay his respects, and the strange presence that had been making him nervous had vanished. He didn't get very much time to ponder the reason behind the vanishing of the other presents. Considering the fact that one of the Kage Bunshin that had just dispelled had been informed by Kakashi that there had been some sort of incident with Sasuke earlier, he decided that it would be better to shelve that mystery for later and should head back to Tazuna's. Sasuke looked down at his arm once more. Someone who was his enemy, and therefore pretty much had an obligation to kill him, had healed him instead. Why? Why do something like that for a complete stranger that you would be fighting, if not then later? Had he healed him so he would have a better fight when the time came? Or had he really done it out of the kindness of his heart, as he had appeared to have done? What the boy who had dressed like a girl had said about finding someone who would give him purpose and becoming happy again had bothered him as well. How would he ever be happy again with his entire family gone? Who would he find that would compare to the people he had lost? And if he did find someone who compared, what would happen to that person if that man were still alive and found out about them? That man had told him that in order to get the eyes he needed to be able to come close to equaling him, he would have to kill the one closest to him. That would naturally be any precious person he found or who found him. Would he really kill his precious person after he found him or her in order to avenge his clan? Most disturbing to him was the fact that a part of himself had said yes. It would seem that to protect this precious person, whoever he or she may be, the best thing to do would be to never find them in order to protect them from himself. Naruto swore. The two bastards from about a week ago had shown up at least a day earlier than expected and in a place that had been completely unexpected considering the usual modus operandi of the sort of missing nin who were of a more mercenary bent, rather than showing up in a place where they could cause a great deal of collateral damage which would have left the team scrabbling to protect innocent bystanders. They had turned up on a newly built section of bridge he hadn't gotten around to trapping yet because he'd run out of certain necessary materials and hadn't found ones he could use to jury-rig traps that would capture a ninja. He was now seriously regretting focusing more on Tazuna's home and the nearby village where he believed an attack more likely due to the fact that the team would be distracted trying to avoid harm befalling innocent bystanders and therefore be more vulnerable. He swore again when he realized that he'd flipping left Tazuna's home almost completely unprotected aside from a few traps he'd shown Tazuna's family to avoid in case he wasn't around to set off the others for some reason, as he deemed automatic traps that didn't require someone there to set them off to be a danger in this case, especially with small children and untrained civilians around. Looking back now, he realized that he should have thought to leave at least one clone behind to activate the traps he had set. As Tetsuo-sensei used to say, bad things happen when people don't think. After he finished swearing, he made a few Kage Bunshin while Sasuke was busy cutting down Zabuza's Mizu Bunshin at Kakashi's urging and dispatched them to Tazuna's residence in case there was someone else waiting in the wings to try something underhanded while he and his team were otherwise occupied. Zabuza had one accomplice with him, and logic dictated that where there was one, there was usually more, and that any of the ones he couldn't see in front of him could be getting up to any amount of mischief. When he turned back to the fight after sending the clones off, the Zabuza guy himself had shown up along with his masked accomplice. The instant after they appeared, Sasuke volunteered to be the one to deal with the accomplice, which meant that he would be hanging back with the rest of the team and protecting the client until it looked like Sasuke needed assistance. Despite the prodigious speed of Zabuza's accomplice, who was so fast that he created his own whirlwind, Sasuke had him evenly matched. This wasn't all that surprising considering that two areas that Sasuke seemed to really shine in were speed and taijutsu, so He was the better choice to face Zabuza's accomplice in a straight-up fight in this case. From the looks of things, Sasuke wouldn't be needing any help despite his opponent's surprising ability to make one-handed seals, which was revealed when Sasuke had restrained the other hand. Based on Sasuke's current speed and the speed of those water, or rather ice summon, Sasuke would be able to easily escape the jutsu. His job for now was to protect the client from Zabuza, who had not yet made a single move in their direction since the destruction of his Mizu Bunshin for some strange reason. Inari had been on the toilet when he had heard the loud swearing coming from outside. His first thought when he'd heard it had been that one of the neighbors had stopped by for a visit and had run afoul of one of Naruto's traps. He'd nearly done that himself on more than one occasion, and had almost had to be rescued once. That initial notion had been thrown out the window when he heard his mother scream and several dishes shatter, however. When he ran out of the toilet to see what was happening, he saw two men with swords taking his mother hostage. One of the men had tattoos on his face that reminded him of clown makeup and was wearing a hoodie, and the other one, who wore an eye patch with 3 straps, was topless and covered in tattoos. When they noticed him, the one with the tattoos on his chest and arms moved to attack him. "If you hurt him, I'll kill myself," his mother said, halting the man in his tracks. "You need a hostage, right? And you won't have one if you harm him." The man, who was some sort of rogue swordsman, turned away from him and back to his mother, who glared at him defiantly, daring him to make a move. The rogue swordsman and his partner then bound his mother and started dragging her away as he stood by and watched helplessly. They had taken his mother, and there had been nothing he could do about it. If Naruto were here, he would, whatever he would do, it wouldn't be standing here watching as his mother was dragged away like he was doing. That Kakashi man had told him as much a couple days earlier. The boy named Naruto who'd lectured him on his first day here came in 5 minutes after the boy named Sasuke, completely wiped from his training. When he slumped over at the dinner table after the meal had ended, it was obvious that he was completely exhausted, even more so than the Sasuke boy, who looked pretty tore up himself. "Why?" he asked. "Why do you do this when it's not even your fight? It's not your country, and it's not your business. Why do you do this even knowing that you're just going to die?" "Because this was once my mother's home. And even if it wasn't her home, I'd do it anyway because it's the right thing to do," Naruto replied, sounding upset. "I could just as easily ask you why you sit around wailing that you can do nothing while your people suffer without even trying to do something about it." Unable to reply to the boy's accusation since he couldn't think of one that didn't sound like a pathetic excuse even to himself, he ran outside. Even though every reply he could think of sounded like an excuse, he knew that there was nothing that he could do about the way things were. He was just too small, and there was only one of him. As he was sitting on the dock that was attached to the house thinking how unfair the Naruto boy's question had been, Naruto's teacher came outside and joined him. "Naruto's like you in some ways," Kakashi-san said. He never knew his father while growing up as well. As he furiously scrubbed the tears from his eyes so he wouldn't look like a total sissy in front of this stranger, he wondered why the man was telling him this. He never knew his mother either, since both of his parents died the day he was born. He had no friends as a small child, but he never let that get him down, and I've never once seen him cry about the fact that he was alone, even when there had been no one there for him. "I think he got tired of crying early on," Kakashi-san continued. He sat still wondering exactly where this story was going, since so far, all he was hearing was that Naruto didn't cry despite the fact that he didn't have any parents. Naruto's life wasn't anything like his, however. No evil man had taken over his home and killed the man he called father right in front of him. What few friends he did manage to make became all the more precious to him because they had been few and far between. Kakashi-san continued. What did this have to do with him? So, Naruto had had a bad life, but not as bad as his. One day, 2 of his friends were killed, and 3 others were badly injured right in front of him, and he was then left to face 2 much larger and stronger opponents alone since there was nobody around to help. Kakashi-san said. "What happened next?" he asked, realizing what the man had finally been getting at. Instead of fleeing, Naruto did what he had to do to save his friends, even though there was a very good chance that he could die doing so. At that point, all he cared about was getting his remaining friends to safety, and he did everything it took to do so despite the fact that he was outarmed, outnumbered, and the enemy held the advantage. Kakashi-san replied. Here he was in a similar situation to the one Naruto had been in back then. His mother was being taken away from him, and rather than fighting, he was sitting and crying about not being able to do anything without even once trying. His stepfather Kaiza had told him that if there was something precious to you, you protected it with your own 2 hands, even if it meant risking dying. Right now, the most precious thing in his life was being taken from him, and he wasn't even trying to protect it. Like hell, there was a time when someone had to stop crying and running away, and stand up to fight for what was theirs no matter how strong the people taking it from them were, and that time was now. Let go of my mom! He yelled at the 2 men who were leading his mother away after he'd run from the house and onto the wooden walkway that led to the path to the village to confront them. Run, Inari! His mother yelled as the 2 men whirled to face him. As she yelled for him to flee, one of the men knocked her to the ground. They had hurt his mother. He was going to kill them. He had no weapons, and the men who had his mother had swords, but that didn't matter. Like in that old story, he would hit them and, if they cut off his arms, he would kick them and, if they cut off his legs, he would bite them to death. He wasn't going to let them take his mother away from him. His mother was one of the most precious things in his life, and he would do everything in his power to protect her. The men moved to attack him, and he suddenly found himself elsewhere. "Thanks for distracting them, kid," said Naruto, who had shown up out of nowhere, taken him out of the path of danger, and was unbinding his mother whom he had rescued as well. "I wasn't sure if I would make it in time." As he stared up at the other boy in wonder, he heard something behind him. When he turned to see what the commotion behind him was, he saw that it was 2 more Narutos who were beating the crap out of the men who had taken his mother. "Seems you really do have a backbone, kid." "Naruto, or was it another one of his clones?" said as he patted him on the head. Moments after the fight started, the 2 men who had taken his mother were down on the ground, bruised, bleeding, and unconscious, brought low by someone who was only half their size. Seeing them in this state, he realized that they were not the insurmountable obstacles he had at first thought them to be. It was as Naruto had said earlier, they were only strong as long as you did nothing. In that case, he would make everyone do something, and they would take the strength away from the biggest of the monsters. He would rally everyone, and have them fight. This was their home, and Gato couldn't have it. "Where are you going?" Naruto asked when he turned back to the house to grab any weapons he could find. "I'm going to get everyone, and we'll get Gato together," he replied. "Well, in that case, I think I'll help. It's better than just hanging around here looking after you guys," Naruto replied. "Besides, I will be needing to tell the villagers what areas to avoid if Boss and the others fail at the bridge, and it comes down to a street fight." Naruto watched as Sasuke became trapped in an unknown jutsu that involved sheets of ice. Within the jutsu, the boy with the name that was very familiar for some reason was peppering Sasuke with saman. He knew for a fact that the boy was deadly accurate with those things since he had paralyzed his master with them by unerringly throwing them at points that were very close to spots that would have been fatal, which made this activity more puzzling, unless the boy wasn't actively trying to kill Sasuke. Outside of the fight between Sasuke and Zabuza's accomplice, there was a virtual standstill as they stood facing Zabuza, who had yet to make a move. Why were their opponents not actively trying to kill them? He knew that part of the reason that Zabuza hadn't tried to kill them was because Kakashi was keeping Zabuza in check in regards to Tazuna, and Zabuza was keeping Kakashi in check in regards to Sasuke. In that fight, either would move until one or the other was certain of their advantage, which was the reason why Zabuza currently wasn't trying to turn them into sashimi with that sword. Sasuke's opponent, however, there was no reason for Zabuza's accomplice to spare Sasuke, no reason at all. He had him completely outclassed in that jutsu, and could have ended it all in the first strike. Instead of killing him right away, however, he was giving Sasuke a very slow death with 1,000 paper cuts and every opportunity to figure out a way to defeat his opponent. As he watched the fight, trying to figure out what Zabuza's accomplice was up to, Sakura went over and tossed a kunai to Sasuke, who had dropped his in the boy Haku's initial attack. The kunai didn't reach its intended recipient, however, because Haku went through the other side of one of the mirrors he'd rather foolishly assumed had been one way and caught the thrown weapon before it could reach Sasuke. This gave him the first bit of good news he'd had throughout the entire battle. If Zabuza's apprentice was forced to fight on both sides of the mirrors, there would be an increased chance of the boy making a mistake that would allow them to defeat him. With that in mind, he made his way over to the unusual jutsu that was a result of a Kekkai Genkai in which Sasuke was trapped, hoping that Sakura and Kakashi would be enough to protect Tazuna should Zabuza finally decide that attacking would be to his advantage. When he reached the dome of ice mirrors, he circled it looking for any weaknesses. There were none that he could see. After his first circuit, he decided to check the strength of the mirrors themselves. As he was powering up one of his wind jutsu, Zabuza threw several shuriken at him, which Haku knocked off course with several saman. "Please let me deal with them, Zabuza-sama," the boy named Haku said as the shuriken clattered to the ground. "Fine, Haku, go ahead," Zabuza replied before turning back to his standoff with Kakashi. Sasuke took the opportunity to attack since Haku was distracted with him, but it didn't do him much good since the boy hadn't been nearly as distracted as he had seemed, and he intercepted Sasuke's attack and made yet another attack on Sasuke. In this attack, Sasuke was hit by about 1,000 more saman, and yet again the needles caused minimal damage, slicing here, scraping there, none of them stabbing into the boy who looked a bit like a pincushion. During Haku's attack on Sasuke, he attacked one of the mirrors with the wind jutsu he'd been in the middle of forming when Zabuza had thrown his shuriken, and it did not break. It didn't even so much as crack. The Zabuza's accomplice responded to this attack by sending a volley of saman in his direction, while tossing yet another one at Sasuke. Undaunted, he attacked the mirror again at the same point that he had attacked it before, hoping to further weaken it. Nothing. He attacked it again. Still nothing. Inside the mirrors, Sasuke used one of his fireball jutsu. The mirror that it hit briefly started to melt by the time the fireball had burned itself out, and rapidly reformed shortly after it had done so. He attacked the mirror that took the brunt of Sasuke's attack, hoping that the melting and reformation of the mirror had weakened it somehow. Nothing there either. Realizing that he was getting nowhere, he decided to use the strongest of his small arsenal of wind jutsu on the mirrors despite the fact that he only had it half-mastered and Tetsuo-sensei would have given him hell for using a jutsu he hadn't fully mastered in battle. After making the seals for the Kazakiri no jutsu, he launched the blade of wind at the mirror closest to him. It barely made a dent. "Why do you try so hard to defend him?" the boy Haku asked. "Is he precious to you?" "No," he replied honestly. "But my mother and the Yondaime entrusted me with the protection of Konoha and its citizens before they died, and they are precious to me. I will not let anyone from Konoha be harmed if there is anything I could do to prevent it. I will not let them down. I too have someone I need to protect," the boy said. "Being a shinobi is difficult for me, and I do not want to kill you, but I will kill my heart and be a shinobi in order to protect my precious person. He has entrusted his dreams to me, and I will not let him down either. I'm sorry." With that, the boy started to attack Sasuke once more. There was nothing he could do about it from out here but try to break the jutsus since the boy was moving far too fast. Perhaps he sent a number of Kage Bunshin into the jutsu to assist Sasuke. They were promptly dispelled, but Zabuza's accomplice had been distracted from Sasuke while they lasted. Hoping to keep the masked boy distracted, he sent in another wave while he attempted to break one of the mirrors with an explosive tag. The mirror yet again refused to break. Hearing some sort of commotion behind him, he turned to look. While he'd been focused on freeing Sasuke, the standoff between Kakashi and Zabuza had finally heated up into a battle. "Why?" Sasuke asked as he watched the masked boy decimate wave after wave of that boy's Kage Bunshin. There were several questions that were running through his mind, and they all boiled down to one: why? Why hadn't the boy killed him earlier? Why wasn't this boy making a serious effort to kill him even now? He had him at his mercy, and yet he still held back. Why was he toying with him in this manner? "I was like you once," the masked boy said as he moved from mirror to mirror. "I lost my precious people when my father killed my mother and tried to kill me." At those words, a memory that was always close to the surface yet again came unbidden, a memory of the day he had lost all who were precious to him. He had come home late from training. The Uchiha district had been totally silent. Unnaturally so. He came across the first of the bodies on one of the side streets after he turned off the main road to say goodnight to his aunt whose light was still on his way home. The main path through the district which led to his house had been completely devoid of corpses, as if it had been deliberately swept clear, but, as he continued to explore, he soon discovered that there were more dead littering the alleys and byways of the Uchiha district, a lot more. After finding what had to be at least half the clan lying dead in what seemed to be oceans of blood, he ran fearfully through the silent streets that were littered with the bodies of his kin, dreading what he'd find at home. After what seemed like an eternity, he finally reached the house his family shared. It was dark and completely silent inside and out, as unnaturally silent as the district had been. Fearing what he would find, he ran through the empty halls frantically searching for his parents and his older brother. Inside his parents' bedroom the bodies of his parents lay in a heap on the floor, one on top of the other. There was a pool of blood around them, and spatters of blood staining the walls. His parents were dead, and he could sense that he wasn't alone in the room. There was someone hiding in the shadows, possibly the same someone who had murdered his parents. As he stood there uncertain whether to fight or flee, the person moved out of the shadows. It was Itachi. The masked boy continued his story, drawing him out of his flashback as he sent another volley of saban in his direction, forcing him to dodge. "My family had been a poor but happy and loving one that had lived on a small farm in water country," the boy said as the saban sailed through the air. "My mother, however, had had a secret that ended up destroying everything when it was discovered. Before I was born, there had been a long and bloody civil war in which those with Kekkai Genkai came to be feared and reviled for having been on the front lines slaughtering thousands upon thousands, shinobi and civilian alike. After the war, having a Kekkai Genkai was basically an automatic death sentence in water country. Despite being a civilian, my mother had been born with a Kekkai Genkai that she had struggled to keep hidden." The boy continued as he settled himself into another mirror and launched another volley of saban. "My mother's Kekkai Genkai had been passed down to me and, one day I discovered my powers and showed them to my mother, not knowing the danger they represented. Unbeknown to either of us, my father had witnessed this. That evening, he and several others from the nearby village came to our home and killed my mother. After they had killed her, my father moved to kill me. I blacked out after that, but when I came to, I learned that I killed my own father." The boy continued as he continued to flash from mirror to mirror, taking out that boy's Kage Bunshin at a rate that was becoming just the tiniest bit easier to see. "It was then that I discovered that loneliness, the feeling of being unwanted, unneeded by anyone, of not having a purpose was the worst feeling in the world," the boy said after he'd taken out another batch of that boy's Kage Bunshin as that boy uselessly hammered away at the mirrors from the outside. "I was starving on the streets alone for a long time until Zabuza-sama found me." The boy continued as he made an attack that prevented him from exiting the mirrors after he thought he'd seen a perfect opening. "He had need of me and my powers which everyone else feared. He took me in, and I became his tool, his weapon, an extension of his will, and anything he asks of me, I will do, even if I have to destroy my own heart to do so." The boy finished as he made an attack on that boy who had apparently done something that had rattled one of the mirrors, and that boy went down with several senbans sticking out of him. Hearing that story, he had to admit that he and the masked boy were alike in some ways, and he could see how the boy could feel sympathy for him because he could understand his pain better than most. Both of them had had someone they had loved and trusted to protect them destroy their family. Both of them had been left completely alone in the world afterward. Of course, that didn't make him stop resenting the other boy who continued to attack him, or stop the other boy from attacking him though. It did however make him wonder how his life could have turned out if he hadn't had a need to avenge his clan to drive him. If he had absolutely nothing left after that man had killed his clan, would he have been the same? Would he have completely subsumed his will to that of the first person that had need of him who came along? He was rather quickly pulled out of his musings because the boy's attacks became even more serious after he finished his story, apparently having reminded himself exactly why he was fighting. Instead of the usual tiny slices, the senban were starting to stab into his body, but he could see every move the other boy made. Was this the Sharingan? Had he finally activated it? Kakashi knew he was growing tired but did his best to not let it show lest Zabuza spotted and exploited this weakness. He had lost a great deal of blood as he made the moves that would put his opponent into check. Fortunately, he wasn't alone in his exhaustion. He could tell that his opponent was becoming exhausted as well, as the unnatural mist had begun to clear because his opponent was unable to continue pumping chakra into it. If his opponent was as exhausted as he appeared, it meant that he would be slower than normal. Good. It was time to finish this. Prepping the field for his finishing move, he pulled out the scroll he used to summon his pack and put blood on it before resealing it, and pressing it into the surface of the bridge. Beneath him, his pack of nindogs made their way to Zabuza, broke through the surface of the bridge, and immobilized the man. After exchanging the usual battle banter, which he could afford to do now that his opponent was immobilized, he powered up a raikiri. Before he could move forward and impale the swordsman of the mist with it, however, an ice mirror formed right next to him, and several senban went flying. Due to his exhaustion, which wasn't being helped by the raikiri that was eating his chakra like crazy, he wasn't as quick as usual, and he failed to dodge. After being impaled by the senban, he fell to the ground unable to move. Fortunately, his dogs had dealt with Zabuza's arms, so, unless Zabuza's accomplice who had so far shown Sasuke and Naruto mercy Sasuke twice had decided to finish him off, there was a good chance he would live. Behind him he could hear a scream of Kakashi. And he could feel a familiar chakra rising, a chakra he had not felt in over 12 years. Naruto's seal was breaking. Everything went black. Momochi Zabuza growled in frustration at the situation he had found himself in. Hatake Kakashi the copy nin was lying on the ground in front of him, and he couldn't do anything to make sure he was finished off thanks to the dogs that were pinning him in place. The one good thing about this situation, however, was that Haku had yet again arrived in the nick of time to save his hide. That boy was more than worth all of the time and effort he had spent on him. Kakashi was down, possibly permanently, but there was a more immediate threat to deal with. There was a new player on the battlefield, a powerful new player. The malevolent chakra he had sensed shortly after the copy ninja had fallen to Haku's senban continued to rise with each passing second. Who or whatever it was could be a serious danger to him. Suddenly, there was a yell to his left, and the blonde Inuzuka boy was racing up to him. As the boy approached, the dogs that had been holding him immobile scattered in all directions with their tails between their legs. He himself barely had time to register the fact that the boy had transformed when he came barreling into him on all fours. As his mind desperately scrabbled to find out what the hell was going on, the clawed and fanged boy with the slit-pupiled red eyes sent him flying and attacked him again. Haku tried to defend him, and got attacked himself for his troubles. After the boy incapacitated Haku, he focused on him once more, barreling into him, and trying to slice him open with his claws. All he could think the entire time this was happening was holy shit. This had most definitely not been how he planned for this attack to go. For the second time in Uzumaki Naruto's life, he was seeing red. That boy Haku had taken out Kakashi, and it was all that Zabuza guy's fault. He'd heard that Haku boy's story, and knew that if that Zabuza guy hadn't made Haku fight, then he wouldn't have and Kakashi would have been fine. He was going to kill him. He was going to kill the both of them. He attacked Zabuza first because he was the one responsible, the one who had been actively trying to kill Kakashi while Haku had been trying to spare him and Sasuke. As he was dealing with the man, Haku tried to attack him. The key word there being tried, he swiftly dealt with Haku and turned back to Zabuza, intent on tearing him apart. As he was about to land the final blow on that Zabuza guy, he smelled danger. Had the Haku boy gotten up? He whirled around in the direction the scent had originated. It wasn't the Haku boy. There was someone else here. No, several someones. He smelled sweat, unwashed bodies, and steel. Lots and lots of steel. There was an army somewhere nearby. How pathetic. Someone he couldn't yet see said. I had hoped you would be able to take the other ninja with you before I took you out, but clearly the demon of the mist isn't all he's cracked up to be. Demon? Pa. More like a minor imp at best. You got brought down by a little kid. He didn't like that voice. There was something wrong about it. Something that reminded him of every unpleasant person he'd run into in his entire life. I should have sent my mercenaries in the first place, since you obviously couldn't get the job done. the person said as the mist that had been obscuring his vision faded. The mist cleared completely, revealing a short, stocky, grayish-brown-haired man in a suit and sunglasses with a cane standing at the head of a small army. He could have sworn he'd seen the man before somewhere, but he couldn't place him. The men standing behind the man were armed to the teeth with a wide variety of weapons which ranged from swords to pikes. Kill the survivors, then move on to the village. The people there need to be taught a lesson. The man at the head of the group, whom he finally realized was the businessman Gato whose picture he'd seen in the paper, said, "Kill the survivors?" But Sasuke and Sakura and Tazuna were the survivors, and he had sworn to protect them, and he never went back on his word. There was no way in hell he would let that happen. There was no way he would let the man who had ordered Zabuza to kill Kakashi take out the rest of his team. The red haze that had been gradually fading overtook him once more, growing deeper until there was nothing left but red. Sasuke couldn't quite process what he was seeing. It had started when the masked boy had left the mirrors entirely in the middle of a battle that had been entirely in his favor for some reason, and less than a minute later the mirrors all shattered, freeing him. Despite the fact that he had been freed, he could do nothing more than sit and watch what happened next, because the masked boy's Samban seriously restricted his mobility and prevented him from doing much else. The first thing he saw after the mirrors shattered was the masked boy lying on the ground. The second was Kakashi, obviously having been taken out by the swordsman Zabuza. The third was that boy tearing the swordsman apart. Then, someone else arrived, someone who had been at the head of an armed mob. It was what happened next after the mercenaries had shown up that he had been unable to process. After the man at the head of the mob had ordered the mob to kill them, that boy changed as he raced towards the men on all fours. As the boy sped towards the group, a strange red energy started bubbling up from that boy, and surrounded him, a strange red energy that caused an ominous feeling to wash over him even where he sat so far away from the coming action. The first thing that boy did when he reached the group was grab the ankle of the fleeing leader, pull him towards him, and tear his throat out. As soon as the leader was dead, he then started on the mob. One man impaled that boy with a spear, and he pulled it out and continued attacking as if nothing had even happened. The wound that the spear had made closed before his very eyes. After the grievous wound that had been caused by the spear had healed, that boy then started cutting a swathe through the group of mercenaries. The men soon began to break ranks and flee when they realized that their weapons were ineffective. That boy would just keep pulling them out, and continue fighting while his wounds healed right before their very eyes. Heedless of the damage he caused as well as the damage that was caused to him, that boy chased the men as they fled over the side of the bridge. What was that boy? He couldn't possibly be human. Naruto! Someone behind him called, gaining his and everyone else's attention. As he watched, that boy turned away from the slaughter and raced over towards the source of the voice, which turned out to belong to Tazuna's small grandson who was at the head of a mob of locals armed with tools and farming equipment. As that boy moved past him, he could see that he had somehow grown claws and fangs, and that the strange marks on his face had grown larger and more feral looking. There was something else as well. That boy's eyes weren't blue, they were red. Naruto! The Tazuna's grandson cried out when that boy was almost on top of him. That boy reached up to attack, but stopped before he landed the final blow. The ominous red energy that boy emitted began to dissipate. The claws shrank back into nails, and the marks turned back into lines. The fangs presumably vanished as well. "Hey Inari," that boy said. "Sorry about that. Just what in the hell was Uzumaki Naruto?" As Naruto spoke with Inari and the mob of villagers who had come with him, Haku had slowly made his way to his fallen master's side. Finally, after what seemed like forever, he reached him. He was weak, in pain, and quite possibly bleeding internally as well as externally, but that didn't matter. Only Zabuza-sama mattered. Zabuza-sama was alive. Barely. He had lost far more blood than was healthy, and would continue to lose even more if he didn't do something. Using one of the few healing jutsu he knew, he pushed his chakra into Zabuza-sama until he was about to pass out. There was a good chance that he wouldn't wake up because he had used up so much of his chakra. There was also a chance that Zabuza-sama would die despite his ministrations as well. He would cross that bridge later when he came to it though. His last thought as his consciousness faded was, if Zabuza-sama dies, then I don't want to wake up. Kakashi groaned when yet another person came to his room in Tazuna's home asking for advice. It was the morning after a major battle. He was suffering from several injuries as well as chakra exhaustion up the wazoo, and he just wanted to sleep. Unfortunately, he had been unable to get any of that sleep he so desperately needed because the nice townsfolk of the village that surrounded Wave's main port kept coming in and bothering him. Things would have been much easier if Momochi Zabuza and that boy Haku had died on the bridge. He was still thanking his lucky stars that Haku wasn't quite the merciless killer that Zabuza had portrayed him to be. Instead of being worm food like he'd half expected to end up being when he'd fallen unconscious, he was going to be laid up for about a week before going home from yet another crappy mission. Of course, prospect of the week's inactivity really sucked because he hated being inactive. When Naruto had learned that he was still alive, and had merely been paralyzed by Haku's Senban, he had ordered the mob of townspeople who had shown up a little too late to drive Gato and his forces out to spare the boy and the swordsman who had been laying unconscious in the middle of a damaged section of bridge. Rather than being torn apart by an angry mob as they would have otherwise been, The two were taken prisoner and dragged off to the town doctor to be fixed up before they were dealt with. The two of them received slightly more sympathy from the townspeople than they would have had when Naruto had revealed that Gato had planned on betraying them and killing them once they had completed the mission for which they'd been hired. Not much more than a little though. Now that they had them, the townspeople wanted to know what to do with the two missing nin, and had turned to him for advice since he was the highest-ranked ninja in the region. Dealing with Haku and Zabuza was a slightly sticky and problematic situation. The townspeople would not be able to keep the two locked up indefinitely as, when they finally recovered from their injuries, they would be able to easily make their escape. They weren't going to be executed either, as Naruto, who was currently the hero of the hour despite his little outburst, had pled for clemency, and the townsfolk had kindly granted it. They couldn't just let the two go on their way, however, and reporting them to the Kirigakure hunter nin would just result in their executions, so they couldn't really do that either. He knew that bringing the two of them to Konoha would be a headache and a half for an entirely different set of reasons from the ones that were plaguing the people of Wave, even if they didn't escape or even try to escape while being transported. Momochi Zabuza was infamous for his attempted assassination of the Yondaime Mizuki Jigura, and having him in Konoha would spark a diplomatic incident with Kiri which Konoha really didn't need at all. Relations were still frosty after that incident with Naruto during last year's Winter Chunin exam, and the reason there hadn't been any sanctions was the fact that Kiri couldn't prove that A. Naruto was a Jinchuriki, and B. that Naruto had been sent to Kiri with malicious intentions on Konoha's part. So, thanks to the fact that Haku and Zabuza had survived, they were stuck in a catch-22. They couldn't keep Zabuza and his accomplice, and they couldn't get rid of them either. Well, technically they could get rid of them, but Naruto would kick up one heck of a fuss which would result in another set of problems. Relations between him and Naruto were bad enough, and he didn't need to bring something like that between the two of them on top of everything else. He really wasn't in the mood for this. He was going to do what he should have done from the beginning and say screw it before kicking this upstairs for the Hokage deal with as soon as he could summon a messenger. Let the Hokage take the fallout. He deserved it, for whatever, the Hokage deserved it. Inari watched in mixed revulsion and satisfaction as the townspeople burned Gato's body. The monster that had haunted his nightmares was dead and gone, brought down by a monster that was also a hero. A good person who turned out to be more than he'd appeared had done something, and the evil one that had been given strength through the inaction of others who turned out to be weaker than everyone had thought him to be had been destroyed. Thanks to Naruto, both his mother and his grandfather were still alive. Rather than say that the enemy was too strong, Naruto had faced down an entire army and had fought to save everyone, even though he would almost certainly have been killed. And, like in the stories, the hero had been given great strength, defeated the monster, sent the villain's forces fleeing, and saved everyone. Well, almost everyone. Some of the construction workers hadn't survived the battle that had raged around them after Gato's ninja had attacked. The thing that mattered most now though was that Wave was free, thanks to Naruto. Even though he should be back at Tazuna's resting, Naruto sat at Haku's bedside and studied the other boy's face as he slept. Dr. Yoshida had taken the boy's mask off when he had been brought in for treatment, and he'd immediately noticed that the boy had very feminine features. He'd also had the niggling feeling that he'd seen him before somewhere, as he looked at the boy's exceedingly feminine face which would likely plague him into adulthood. Because that feeling had bothered him like an itch he couldn't scratch, he racked his brain trying to figure out where it could have been that he'd seen the boy before. Finally, it came to him. The boy looked just like a very nice girl he'd once met. He was seated on a worn stool in front of the counter of a slightly run-down ramen stand in a foreign village. The nice girl who had led him here was seated next to him. They had introduced themselves to each other, as they waited for the old man to finish making their ramen. Her name was Haku, which was rather strange since that was a boy's name. Tell me, the girl asked slightly nervously. Do you have someone precious to you? Someone that you would do anything to protect? He had been so nice to him back then, had been one of the very few good things that had happened to him in Kiri. He'd almost forgotten him, in all the general unpleasantness that had occurred later, and now, he'd almost killed him. He had completely lost control of himself, and had almost killed someone who had shown him nothing but kindness and mercy. He had almost killed a friend of his as well yesterday. Inari would have died if he hadn't regained control of himself at the last second. Morishita-san had warned him that something like this would happen if he let his rage control him after the first time this had happened, when he was in Kiri. She had told him to rein in his temper and find a safe outlet for it. He apparently hadn't. He had lost control again, and had let even more of the fox out, the fox that his mother and the Yondaime had trusted him to keep sealed away. He had failed them. As he wallowed in his guilt as he waited for Haku to wake, the Zabuza guy groaned from the other bed in Dr. Yoshida's small clinic. He had just returned to consciousness, and was undoubtedly in a massive amount of pain. It had been touch and go with him last night, and his survival had not been certain. He had pulled through however, and, if his wounds didn't get infected or something, he should survive. They had nearly lost Haku due to his injuries and the chakra exhaustion last night as well, and he was still in danger until he woke up. The two of them wouldn't have been in nearly as bad a condition as they were currently in if he hadn't completely lost it. It was one thing to kill your enemies in battle, it was something else entirely when you lose it, almost kill your enemies, and become a danger to everyone around you, including your allies, like he had done. If he didn't find a way to stay in control of himself during these kinds of situations, one of the dead was going to end up being a friend or a teammate someday. Sakura stood outside the town's small, rundown medical building, uncertain about whether she should go inside or not. Naruto was inside, and she wasn't certain if she was ready to face him yet. What she had seen yesterday had really shaken her. Naruto had snapped. Naruto had more than snapped. Naruto had turned into a monster. What had happened to the nice, cheerful but annoying boy that she had remembered from the academy? Had he always been like this? Is this why everyone avoided him and told their children not to play with him? She had heard of Kekkai Genkai before, but none of the ones in Konoha that she'd heard about matched what she had seen. His mother had been a foreigner though. His mother had come from here in fact. The doctor who ran the clinic was old, probably old enough to remember Naruto's family. Maybe she would know whether or not Naruto had a whirlpool Kekkai Genkai. With her mind finally made up, she finally entered the building. The doctor was sitting in a chair resting, having spent the night tending to her 2 patients who had been in critical condition when they arrived. The 2 patients were occupying beds at either end of the room, and Naruto was sitting next to the boy's bed, watching the boy with a serious expression on his face. "Yoshida-san?" she said, trying to get the doctor's attention. "I was wondering if I could ask you a question." She was slightly uncertain about asking with Naruto present, but it was probably better than going behind his back. If Naruto objected to the question, he could ask the doctor not to answer it, but she really wanted to know the answer however. "What is it?" Dr. Yoshida asked tiredly, sitting up straighter in the chair she had been slumped in. "Well, I was wondering if you knew if the Uzumaki had a Kekkai Genkai. What Naruto did yesterday didn't match any of the Konoha Kekkai Genkai I've heard about," she replied, almost timidly. "The Uzumaki were famous for their red hair, their sealing skills, and living to a very ripe old age, but I don't think that those were Kekkai Genkai." "Why?" Dr. Yoshida replied after a minute of thought. "Well, yesterday, Naruto grew claws and fangs, and there was this strange red chakra surrounding him, and I thought it might be a Kekkai Genkai," she answered. "Jinchuriki." Momochi Zabuza moaned from his bed. Dr. Yoshida gasped at this, looking shocked and sickened. "What's Jinchuriki?" she asked. "About the most horrible thing anyone could do to a child," Dr. Yoshida replied. "To make a Jinchuriki, you seal one of the Biju into a living child, usually an infant, since the beast's chakra would normally kill an adult. The Jinchuriki are used as weapons by their village." "I'm not a weapon," Naruto growled from where he sat by Haku, apparently having listened to the entire conversation despite the rapt attention he seemed to be paying the unconscious boy. "My mom and the Yondaime sealed the fox inside me to keep Konoha safe. They wanted me to protect everyone from it." A pain-filled "holy shit" came from Zabuza's direction. Sasuke froze with his back against the wall. He had been standing by the open window of the clinic providing extra security in case one of the injured ninja decided to take one of the more popular hospital exits in an attempt to escape. What he just heard. That boy had the Kyuubi sealed inside him. The Kyuubi that had vanished after Uchiha Madara had used it in his battle against the Shodai Hokage at the Valley of the End, and had reappeared 12 years ago only to be disposed of by the Yondaime who had given his life to do so, disposed of on the day that boy had been born. He remembered asking his father how the Kyuubi had died after he'd heard the rather sketchy story that had been told to his entire year during a special assembly that had taken place on the Yondaime's birthday during his first year at the academy. He'd asked his father because he thought he would know how the Kyuubi had been killed because the academy instructor who told the story had refused to tell them how the Yondaime had killed the Kyuubi. In fact, the man yelled at that boy for asking when he had told the combined classes the tale of the Yondaime's sacrifice for the village. When he'd asked, his father had looked like he'd been about to say something about it, but he suddenly changed his mind and told him not to ask ever again, that the Yondaime had defeated the Kyuubi, and that was all he needed to know about the subject. Had his father known about Naruto? Had that academy instructor known? And if they had known, who else knew, and why hadn't they shared their knowledge? Zabuza had heard the rumors of the Kyuubi Jinchuriki that had been cropping up lately, but hadn't put much stock in them, as there had not even been a whisper about a Kyuubi Jinchuriki in the generations since the Jinchuriki first started being made. The rumors had started after some sort of incident that took place during the Chunin exams over a year ago. Supposedly, according to the rumors he'd heard, the Kyuubi Jinchuriki was a small blonde boy. A blonde boy, like the one that had nearly taken him out on the bridge. The existence of the Jinchuriki had not been confirmed, until now that is. He had nearly been killed by, and was currently lying helpless in the same room as the Kyuubi Jinchuriki who was sitting by the bedside of Haku who was also helpless. He should have followed that damn fortune-teller's advice and not accepted any business contracts on that day. But no, he had to go and accept Gato's offer, and look where it had gotten him. He'd been betrayed by his employer before he could betray the man, was down 2 followers, was badly injured, and was the prisoner of a bunch of Konoha shinobi, one of which was Sharingan Kakashi, and another of which was the Kyuubi Jinchuriki who he hadn't believed in. To make matters worse, he had done all that work and nearly gotten himself killed twice in order to get funds for another coup attempt, and he hadn't seen a single ryo for his effort. Today really sucked. In fact, the entire week had blue chunks. Kakashi felt like slamming his head against the nearest wall, and probably would have if he could get up to do so. Thanks to someone's boneheaded stupidity, he now had to explain the Sandame's law to one of his students who happened to be one of the biggest gossips in Konoha. As if things hadn't been going badly enough already, Naruto had let the cat out of the bag with the help of Momochi Zabuza and a doctor who knew way too much about Jinchuriki for her own good. He could probably try to have Zabuza executed on the grounds of knowing classified information, but that would be flimsy at best, and Naruto probably knew it. Because as far as Kiri and therefore Zabuza were concerned, that particular cat had been out of the bag and running around the house for over a year. The fact that Zabuza had said Jinchuriki in speculation according to witness accounts rather than saying Naruto is the QB Jinchuriki was a pesky technicality that might protect him from the Sandame's law, which probably couldn't be enforced in his case anyway because he wasn't a citizen of Konoha, but probably could, considering the fact that he was currently a prisoner of Konoha's forces and therefore under their jurisdiction until he was either executed or repatriated. He could still kill the demon of the mist over it, but Naruto would raise an almighty stink, and relations between the two of them were cool enough already because he was a villain in Naruto's eyes for taking him from a teacher he'd grown attached to. Kill two more people that Naruto was attached to, and he'd most likely end up being dead to the boy. He couldn't teach his sensei's son if the boy completely disavowed his existence. He would have to consult with the Hokage on that, and see what he thought when he summoned his messenger. As far as he was concerned, the Hokage could be the villain in this situation and sort this whole Zabuza mess out. And the sooner he did it, the better. He would be able to summon a messenger to send a report back to Konoha tomorrow, or the next day at the latest. He planned on summoning Ahei as he was his fastest runner. His day had been completely screwed an hour earlier when he'd been trying to sleep and Sakura had come in asking about Jinchuriki and Naruto in particular. He'd been forced to explain that yes, a 20-story tall fox made entirely of chakra had been sealed into Naruto on the day he had been born, and that no, Naruto wasn't usually a danger to himself or others, had not been since day one. And no, Naruto hadn't known about the Kyuubi himself until recently. Before he could get a word in edgewise about the Sandame's law regarding the subject, she'd left the room to go and do whatever. Sasuke had come in after he dozed off again and further ruined his day by demanding information about the Uzumaki. He found it rather odd that the boy didn't know anything more about Uchiha Madara and his ability to control the Kyuubi than what any schoolchild knew, which was that the man had used the creature in a battle with the Shodai Hokage at the Valley of the End where he died. His clan and the law had apparently kept the boy sheltered against the suspicions against the Uchiha in regards to the Kyuubi's attack. Fortunately, Sasuke had stuck around for a brief overview of the law and the reasons surrounding it, as that was part of the information he wanted to know. If it had been merely for Naruto's sake, the law wouldn't have required such a draconian punishment. The identities of the Kyuubi Jinchuriki had been closely guarded secrets in Konoha for generations. The first Jinchuriki had been rumored to have been the Shodai Hokage's wife Senju, née Uzumaki, Mito, but that had never been confirmed or denied. There had been rumors amongst the older generations that Hashirama and Mito's two children had had whisker marks on their cheeks like Naruto's, but that couldn't be confirmed, though they had always been wearing heavy makeup in the few surviving photographs there were of them. Someone had obviously taken Mito's place as Jinchuriki if she had been one in the first place, since she died long before the Kyuubi attack, but it was not known, at least to the majority of the village at large, exactly who. There had been some whispers about Kushina-san that everyone in the know had refused to confirm or deny, though. He knew he should have listened to his horoscope when it said that any journeys undertaken on that day would be filled with misfortune. He had been attacked, stabbed, practically sliced open, nearly drowned, paralyzed, suffered from chakra exhaustion twice, and now was forced to explain to the kiddies exactly why they couldn't tell their friends about Naruto's status as a Jinchuriki, and also be forced to explain to the Hokage that they knew, and exactly why they knew. And here he thought he'd be taking a nice little seaside vacation. This mission completely blew. Sakura wasn't sure how she should feel about Naruto, but she could understand how he came to be the way he was. Someone had taken an infant on the day it was born and, in a completely monstrous act, had sealed a demon inside of it with the consent of at least one of its parents. Just about everyone in the village who had been alive and able to understand what was going on at the time knew about this, and hated Naruto because of it. Naruto had grown up completely alone without either of his parents, who had also died in the Kyuubi's attack like so many other people had done that day. He'd been unloved, unwanted, and uncared for, and before he could make any friends, the adults had poisoned their children against him. It was the perfect conditions to make a monster, and yet, Naruto wasn't one, not exactly. If Naruto had truly been a monster, he would have killed her or really broken her arm instead of merely threatening to do so when she had attacked him that day at the academy. If Naruto had truly been a monster, he would have killed everyone on that bridge when he had lost control instead of just Gado's men. If Naruto had truly been a monster, he would not have cared about this place or its people in the first place, and therefore wouldn't have even bothered with the battle. If Naruto had truly been a monster, he would not have cared if his teammates lived or died and wouldn't have taken their survival into consideration. If Naruto had truly been a monster, he would not have sworn to protect Konoha either. While Naruto just barely kept a monster contained, Naruto himself was not a monster. What would her life have been like if the yandere had asked her parents for permission instead of Naruto's? Would her parents have kept her despite the fact that the entire village would have hated her and wanted her gone? Would they have still loved her, or would they have feared her because of what she had kept contained? Would she have had any friends? Would she have managed to survive without friends the way Naruto had? Would she have viewed the protection of Konoha and its citizens as her responsibility the way Naruto had, despite the fact that most of them hated him, or would she have completely despised Konoha instead? Would she have been nearly as strong as Naruto was now? Would she have had his courage? Would she have had his empathy, and his sense of duty, or would she have become the monster many people seem to think Naruto is? Sasuke sat in a tree to think, as he often did when he had a thorny problem that couldn't be ignored which he had to sort out. The conversation he'd had with Kakashi had both been rather informative, and had brought up a slew of questions. While he'd been pumping Kakashi for information about that boy, Kakashi had been trying to weasel information out of him that he honestly didn't know and therefore couldn't give. Kakashi's offhand comment about rumors about his father and the QB confused and upset him. His father would never have done something like that. Konoha was his home, and several Uchiha had died that day defending Konoha from the fox. His father would never have senselessly thrown away the lives of any of the members of his clan. He could understand how a civilian might think that though. Madara, who had been a Uchiha, had somehow controlled the QB and forced it to fight Senju Hashirama. People could then logically come to the assumption that Madara had passed the secret of how to do this on to the clan. If Madara had, however, he hadn't found it, and it definitely wasn't in the Uchiha's secret hiding place, as he'd already thoroughly searched it, looking for what that man had told him about. All he'd found down there was the secret of attaining the Mangekyo Sharingan and a bunch of maps with patrol routes on them that made absolutely no sense since they completely bypassed the worst parts of the village and heavily concentrated officers around the Hokage Tower, administration complex, and the shelter behind the Hokage monument. Another question that came to mind was why that boy? What had been so special about him that had made the yandere pick him out of all of the infants in Konoha? Had it been because his parents had volunteered him before the yandere could ask anyone else, or had it been for some other reason? He could have used power like that. He could have used it to completely destroy that man. He was a Uchiha and therefore should have been able to control the QB's powers the way Madara did somehow. He would have used the QB to turn that man into paste. But then again, the Shodai Hokage had taken control of the QB away from Madara, and killed him before he could get it back. There was a distinct possibility that that boy had been selected because he'd been born with whatever it was that had allowed the Shodai Hokage to seize control of the QB from Madara. If that were the case, that man could have found and used that boy if he'd had the QB sealed inside him instead of that boy, that infuriating boy who was so far ahead of him it wasn't even funny, that boy who would more than likely achieve his goal before he achieved his ambition. That boy had always been going on about being Hokage, even when he was in the academy. Did he know something everyone else didn't? Had he been groomed for the position from the start, according to history, and what he'd heard about the Uzumaki clan from Kakashi when the man had explained that Naruto hadn't really adopted him since the knowing consent of both parties was required or kids would be passed back and forth through several clans each time another kid unthinkingly loaned out their clothes as Naruto had done. The Uzumaki had been closely related to and intermarried with the Senju. Two of the Hokage had been Senju, the third had studied under both of the first two Hokage, and the fourth had studied under one of the third's students. As that boy was related to the Senju, and on a team under the student of the yandere, it would be logical to assume that he would be selected as the Sandame's successor. Great. He'd been doing just about everything he could to alienate and piss off the next Hokage. Things were going to go real well for him when he restored his clan. Not. He now knew why Naruto had been placed on the team since it was glaringly obvious when you bothered to stop and think about it. He didn't bother to question why he was on the team as the answer to that question could be summed up in one word, Sharingan. Considering the fact that he was the last of the Uchiha besides that man, and that that boy was the future Hokage, what the hell was Sakura doing on the team? Haku groaned as he awoke, and winced as the light attacked his eyes as usual since, for some strange reason, his eyes became extremely light-sensitive when he suffered from chakra exhaustion. He could barely see, but he could tell that he was in a bed somewhere within the town that was located near the bridge, and that someone other than Zabuza-sama had brought him here, since Zabuza-sama was aware of his light sensitivity, and would never have stuck him next to an open window and left the blinds up. Had he completely failed Zabuza-sama? Had Zabuza-sama died? What would he do now that he'd failed? Pull the shades, the light's hurting the kid's eyes, said a voice that Haku had feared that he'd never hear again, cutting through his rising panic. As he nearly fainted in relief that he hadn't completely failed his master, someone hastily moved to close the blinds. He caught a flash of yellow, dark orange, and brown. Soon, the shades were drawn, and he was better able to focus on who it was. It was Naruto. While he was afraid of Naruto because of what the boy could do, he understood. He had seen the look of rage, pain, and grief that had been on the boy's face when he had transformed and attacked Zabuza-sama when he believed that his sensei had been killed. If it had been Zabuza-sama who had been killed, or appeared to have been killed instead, he would have done the same thing. He couldn't call Naruto a monster because, what would that make him since he too had a Kekkai Genkai? And Naruto wasn't a monster, he hadn't killed indiscriminately, he had only killed those who had threatened him and his, albeit in a rather vicious manner. "I'm sorry, Haku," Naruto said sadly when he realized that he was looking at him. "Please forgive me." What reason did Naruto have to apologize to him? He'd done nothing but hurt the boy. He'd deceived him the day he met him, and used him as a distraction in order to escape. He'd wandered around the home of the boy's ancestors as if it were his own private playground without once paying his respects to them. He'd attacked the boy, attacked his teammates, and attacked his sensei, making him believe that he'd killed the man. What reason did Naruto have for begging his forgiveness? It should be the other way around. He should be the one begging Naruto for forgiveness. "I forgive you," he finally said after yanking himself out of his litany of the cruelties he had heaped upon the younger boy, seeing that his lack of an answer had caused the boy even more pain. The Sandaime Hokage stared at the report that one of Kakashi's Niken had brought in, which sat innocuously at the edge of his desk as if it were a poisonous snake, almost afraid to open it and discover what sort of nightmare it contained. Reports were usually given at the end of a mission after everything was said and done, and everyone had all gone home either happy or dead depending on the type of mission assigned. When they arrived in the middle of a mission, it meant that something had gone very seriously wrong, and that someone needed to head out there post-haste to clean up the mess. He just knew that he really didn't want to find out what sort of mess Kakashi and his team could create in a week and a half though. What could go so wrong on a C-ranked mission that was basically little more than a glorified walk with a seaside vacation tacked onto the end of it that would result in a mid-mission report? The customer in question had been particularly trying, but not so much so that he'd be turned away for fear of his escort killing him before he reached his destination. Oh god, Sasuke hadn't snapped and killed the client, had he? Kakashi had been telling him that the boy had some anger issues, but he'd waved them off as not being too serious, as the boy had not been behaving overly aggressively. Knowing that he'd have to get it over with eventually and dreading what he would find, he carefully broke the seal on the scroll. After unfurling the scroll, he skimmed the document, stopped, and began to read it more thoroughly, hoping to all that was holy that he had misread what had been written while he'd been skimming the report. He hadn't. Naruto's curse had struck big time and the C rank had turned into an A rank, and then, when everyone had thought it was over, it had really hit the fan. There had been another incident with Naruto on the bridge, and there had been a large number of witnesses this time. Naruto's teammates were now aware of his status as the QB Jinchuriki, and to make matters worse, Kakashi had a pair of high-risk prisoners he didn't know what to do with, since Naruto had grown rather attached to one of them, making executing them rather problematic for the man whom Naruto had yet to warm up to. Damn. He knew that he wouldn't have wanted to know. Things would have been a whole lot easier if it had just been one of the genin snapping and killing the client. He could have found a way to sweep that under the rug at least. It had happened often enough over the years. As for the prisoners that Kakashi had taken, he could deal with those. He would send a team of ANBU to retrieve Zabuza and his young accomplice. That would give him time to figure out what he was going to do with them, and how to explain to Naruto exactly why he had to do what he had done afterward. Danzo choked slightly on his morning tea as he read the report he'd picked up after a nice relaxing 3-day weekend at a bed and breakfast in a nearby town. Things had been going slowly lately, so he had rather foolishly thought that he could take the time off to relax and not bother focusing on work as he had done for the last several decades. He'd thought he'd set everything up so that it would go smoothly without him there to supervise every little detail for a few days, but he was wrong. This was what he got for trying to take a vacation once in the nearly 60 years that he'd been a shinobi. Gato was dead, and without him there to hire thugs to threaten a few families and break a few bones when bribes didn't work, a number of stalled investigations into his businesses were now rapidly progressing. Because of this, he could stand to lose millions in funding for Root. Not only had he heavily invested in Gato's corporations and the man's less-than-legal activities, but Gato had hired a number of his operatives for some of his more clandestine operations. Without Gato to head Gato Corporation, the company was going to fall apart, especially after the results of the various investigations became public knowledge. Even if he managed to cash out all of his Gato Corporation stock, the price had already fallen to a point where it would be at a loss on his initial investment following the news of Gato's demise. Adding to this little shitfest was the fact that a thorn in his side that he thought Gato would deal with knowing the man's tendencies was still alive. Momochi Zabuza had the potential to become the Mizukage should he finally manage to get his coup off the ground. Unlike most potential Mizukage candidates, the man was ruthless and capable, and while he was willing to sell himself to the highest bidder to get the funds he needed, he was a staunch patriot in his own way. What's worse, the man had his own sense of honor that would preclude him dealing with him, and the loyalty of his followers even though he had flat out told them that they were nothing more to him than tools to help him reach his ambition. All in all, Momochi Zabuza not a good candidate for the position in his opinion. Kirigakure needed a relatively weak Mizukage so they would not be a threat to Konoha, and that was most definitely not Zabuza. Another person that was rapidly becoming a thorn in his side was the Jinchuriki. It was because of the boy that the most major problem that had cropped up during his short vacation that he wished he was back on, if only because he didn't want to deal with this mess. He had known that boy would be trouble the instant he saw the drooling bundle of joy who looked so much like his mother, who had been a headache and a half in his opinion. When he had seen him again with the boy who had taken him under his wing, he'd upwardly revised the amount of trouble the Jinchuriki would be. The reality, however, was turning out to be much worse. Rubbing his temples in order to ward off an impending headache, he called for several teams of root operatives whom he ordered to clear out all evidence of their dealings from Gado's holdings. He then called for a team which he then ordered to take out Zabuza before the man could escape and cause even more problems that he and Konoha didn't need. That team would of course be at a greater risk than the other one because they were going to be wearing the emblem of a foreign nation so that the ANBU team that the Hokage had sent out wouldn't be alerted to Root's continued existence. Over in Water Country, the government in Kirigakure had been in complete disarray since the Yandere Mizuki Jigura had bit the big one a few months back, and the Sanbai escaped its seal, cutting a swathe of destruction through the village on its way down to the sea. Considering the situation, it was completely understandable that the report regarding Zabuza's possible presence in Wave had gotten kicked around for a few weeks before it finally reached the Hunter Nin. After bouncing around several departments, the report finally reached the desk of a rather capable captain who had taken charge of the Hunter Nin until an acceptable candidate for the position of Godame Mizukage could be found. After finishing the paperwork he had in front of him, he opened and read the report, swore at its age, and assigned a reasonably skilled team to check out Wave and see if Zabuza's trail could be picked up there. Momochi Zabuza had been a thorn in his backside for far too long.